Chapter 43. The card dangled above the old lady's bed. It read, "God is near." But it wasn't like the usual religious text. It didn't have a frame or ornate printing. It was just a strip of cardboard about 8 inches long, with plain lettering which might have said, "No smoking" or "Exit," and it was looped carelessly over an old gas bracket, so that Miss Stubbs, from where she lay, could look up at it and read, "God is near," in square, black capitals. There wasn't much more Miss Stubbs could see, perhaps a few feet of privet hedge through the frayed curtains, but mainly it was just the cluttered little room which had been her world for so many years. The room was on the ground floor and in the front of the cottage, and as I came out through the wilderness which had once been a garden, I could see the dogs watching me from where they had jumped up onto the old lady's bed. And when I knocked on the door, the place almost erupted with their barking. It was always like this. I had been visiting regularly for over a year, and the pattern never changed. The furious barking. Then Mrs. Broadwith, who looked after Miss Stubbs, would push all the animals but my patient into the back kitchen and open the door. And I would go in and see Miss Stubbs in the corner in her bed with the card hanging over it. She had been there for a long time and would never get up again. But she never mentioned her illness and pain to me. All her concern was for her 3 dogs and 2 cats. Today it was old Prince, and I was worried about him. It was his heart. Just about the most spectacular valvular incompetence I'd ever heard. He was waiting for me as I came in, pleased as ever to see me, his long, fringed tail waving gently. The sight of that tail used to make me think there must be a lot of Irish setter in Prince, but I was inclined to change my mind as I worked my way forward over the bulging black and white body to the shaggy head and upstanding Alsatian ears. Miss Stubbs often used to call him Mr. Hines, and though he may have not had 57 varieties in him, his hybrid vigour had stood him in good stead. With his heart, he should have been dead long ago. "I thought I'd best give you a ring, Mr. Herriot," Mrs. Broadwith said. She was a comfortable elderly widow with a square, ruddy face contrasting sharply with the pinched features on the pillow. "He's been coughing right bad this week, and this morning he was a bit staggery. Still eats well, though." "I bet he does." I ran my hands over the rolls of fat on the ribs. "It would take something really drastic to put old Prince off his grub." Miss Stubbs laughed from the bed, and the old dog, his mouth wide, eyes dancing, seemed to be joining in the joke. I put my stethoscope over his heart and listened, knowing well what I was going to hear. They say the heart is supposed to go lub-dub, lub-dub, but Prince's went swish-swoosh, swish-swoosh. There seemed to be nearly as much blood leaking back as there was being pumped into the circulatory system. And another thing. The swish-swoosh was a good bit faster than last time. He was on oral digitalis, but it wasn't quite doing its job. Gloomily, I moved the stethoscope over the rest of the chest. Like all old dogs with chronic heart weakness, he had never-present bronchitis, and I listened without enthusiasm to the symphony of whistles, rails, squeaks, and bubbles which signalled the workings of Prince's lungs. The old dog stood very erect and proud, his tail still waving slowly. He always took it as a tremendous compliment when I examined him, and there was no doubt he was enjoying himself now. Fortunately, his was not a very painful ailment. Straightening up, I patted his head, and he responded immediately by trying to put his paws on my chest. He didn't quite make it, and even that slight exertion started his ribs heaving and his tongue lolling. I gave him an intramuscular injection of digitalin, and another of morphine hydrochloride, which he accepted with apparent pleasure as part of the game. "I hope that will steady his heart and breathing, Miss Stubbs. You'll find he'll be a bit dopey for the rest of the day, and that'll help too. Carry on with the tablets, and I'm going to leave you some more medicine for his bronchitis." I handed over the bottle of my old standby mixture of ipecacuanha and ammonium acetate. The next stage of the visit began now, as Mrs. Broadwith brought me a cup of tea and the rest of the animals were let out of the kitchen. There were Ben, a Sealyham, and Sally, a Cocker Spaniel, and they started a deafening barking contest with Prince. They were closely followed by the cats, Arthur and Susie, who stalked in gracefully and began to rub themselves against my trouser legs. It was the usual scenario for the many cups of tea I had drunk with Miss Stubbs under the little card which dangled above her bed. "How are you today?" I asked. "Oh, much better," she replied, and immediately, as always, changed the subject. Mostly she liked to talk about her pets and the ones she had known right back to her girlhood. She spoke a lot, too, about the days when her family were alive. She loved to describe the escapades of her 3 brothers, and today she showed me a photograph which Mrs. Broadwith had found at the bottom of a drawer. I took it from her, and 3 young men in the knee breeches and the round caps of the 90s smiled up at me from the yellowed old print. They all held long churchwarden pipes, and the impish humour in their expressions came down undimmed over the years. "My word! They look really bright lads, Miss Stubbs," I said. "Oh, they were young rips," she exclaimed. She threw back her head and laughed, and for a moment her face was radiant, transfigured by her memories. The things I had heard in the village came back to me. About the prosperous father and his family who lived in the big house many years ago. Then the foreign investments which crashed, and the sudden change in circumstances. "When t'owd fella died, he was about skint," an old man had said. "There's not much brass there now." Probably just enough brass to keep Miss Stubbs and her animals alive and to pay Mrs. Broadwith. Not enough to keep the garden dug or the house painted or for any of the normal little luxuries. And sitting there drinking my tea with the dogs in a row by the bedside and the cats making themselves comfortable on the bed itself, I felt as I'd often felt before, a bit afraid of the responsibility I had. The one thing which brought some light into the life of the brave old woman was the transparent devotion of her shaggy bunch whose eyes were never far from her face. And the snag was that they were all elderly. There had in fact been 4 dogs originally, but one of them, a truly ancient golden Labrador, had died a few months previously. And now I had the rest of them to look after, and none of them less than 10 years old. They were perky enough, but all showing some of the signs of old age. Prince with his heart. Sally beginning to drink a lot of water, which made me wonder if she was starting with pyometra. Ben growing steadily thinner with his nephritis. I couldn't give him new kidneys, and I hadn't much faith in the hexamine tablets I had prescribed. Another peculiar thing about Ben was that I was always having to clip his claws. They grew at an extraordinary rate. The cats were better, though Susie was a bit scraggy, and I kept up a morbid kneading of her furry abdomen for signs of lymphosarcoma. Arthur was the best of the bunch. He never seemed to ail anything beyond a tendency for his teeth to tartar up. This must have been in Miss Stubbs' mind, because when I had finished my tea, she asked me to look at him. I hauled him across the bedspread and opened his mouth. "Yes, there's a bit of the old trouble there. Might as well fix it while I'm here." Arthur was a huge, grey, neutered Tom, a living denial of all those theories that cats are cold-natured, selfish, and the rest. His fine eyes looked out on the world with an all-embracing benevolence and tolerance. His every movement was marked by immense dignity. As I started to scrape his teeth, his chest echoed with a booming purr like a distant outboard motor. There was no need for anybody to hold him. He sat there placidly and moved only once, when I was using forceps to crack off a tough piece of tartar from a back tooth and accidentally nicked his gum. He casually raised a massive paw as if to say, "Have a care, chum." But his claws were sheathed. My next visit was less than a month later, and was in response to an urgent summons from Mrs. Broadwith at 6 o'clock in the evening. Ben had collapsed. I jumped straight into my car, and in less than 10 minutes was threading my way through the overgrown grass in the front garden, with the animals watching from their window. The barking broke out as I knocked, but Ben's was absent. As I went into the little room, I saw the old dog lying on his side, very still, by the bed. DOA is what we write in the daybook. Dead on arrival. Just 3 words, but they cover all kinds of situations. The end of milk fever cows, bloated bullocks, calves in fits. And tonight they meant that I wouldn't be clipping old Ben's claws anymore. It wasn't often these nephritis cases went off so suddenly, but his urine albumin had been building up dangerously lately. "Well, it was quick, Miss Stubbs. I'm sure the old chap didn't suffer at all." My words sounded lame and ineffectual. The old lady was in full command of herself. No tears, only a fixity of expression, as she looked down from her bed at her companion of so many years. My idea was to get him out of the place as quickly as possible, and I pulled a blanket under him and lifted him up. As I was moving away, Miss Stubbs said, "Wait a moment." With an effort, she turned onto her side and gazed at Ben. Still, without changing expression, she reached and touched his head lightly. Then she lay back calmly as I hurried from the room. In the back kitchen, I had a whispered conference with Mrs. Broadwith. "I'll run down to the village and get Fred Manners to come and bury him," she said. "And if you've got time, could you stay with the old lady while I'm gone? Talk to her like. It'll do her good." I went back and sat down by the bed. Miss Stubbs looked out of the window for a few moments, then turned to me. "You know, Mr. Herriot," she said casually, "it will be my turn next." "What do you mean?" "Well, tonight Ben has gone, and I'm going to be the next one. I just know it." "Oh, nonsense. You're feeling a bit low, that's all. We all do when something like this happens." But I was disturbed. I had never even heard her hint at such a thing before. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I know there's something better waiting for me. I've never had any doubts." There was silence between us as she lay calmly looking up at the card on the gas bracket. Then the head on the pillow turned to me again. "I have only one fear." Her expression changed with startling suddenness as if a mask had dropped. The brave face was almost unrecognizable. A kind of terror flickered in her eyes, and she quickly grasped my hand. "It's my dogs and cats, Mr. Herriot. I'm afraid I might never see them when I'm gone, and it worries me so. You see, I know I'll be reunited with my parents and my brothers, but—" "Well, why not with your animals?" "Well, that's just it, you see." She rocked her head on the pillow, and for the first time I saw tears on her cheeks. "They say animals have no souls." "Who says?" "I've read it, and I know lots of religious people believe it." "Well, I don't believe it." I patted the hand which still grasped mine. "If having a soul means being able to feel love and loyalty and gratitude, then animals are better off than a lot of humans. You've nothing to worry about there." "Oh, I hope you're right. Sometimes I lie at night thinking about it." "I know I'm right, Miss Stubbs, and don't you argue with me. They teach us vets all about animal souls." The tension left her face, and she laughed with a return of her old spirit. "Look, I'm sorry to bore you with this, but I'm not going to talk about it again. But before you go, I want you to be absolutely honest with me. I don't want reassurance from you, just the truth. I know you're very young, but please tell me, what are your beliefs? Will my animals go with me?" She stared intently into my eyes. I shifted in my chair and swallowed once or twice. "Miss Stubbs, I'm afraid I'm a bit foggy about all this. But I'm absolutely certain of one thing. Wherever you are going, they are going too." She still stared at me, but her face was calm again. "Thank you, Mr. Herriot. I know you're being honest with me. That is what you really believe, isn't it?" "I do believe it," I said. "With all my heart, I believe it." It must have been about a month later, and it was entirely by chance that I learnt I had seen Miss Stubbs for the last time. When a lonely, penniless old woman dies, people don't rush up to you in the street to tell you. I was on my rounds, and a farmer happened to mention that the cottage in Corby village was up for sale. "But, what about Miss Stubbs?" I asked. "Oh, went off sudden about 3 weeks ago. House is in a bad state, they say. Now it's been done to it for years." "Mrs. Broadwith isn't staying on, then?" "Nay, I hear she's staying at t'other end of the village. Do you know what happened to the dogs and cats?" "What dogs and cats?" I cut my visit short. And I didn't go straight home, though it was nearly lunchtime. Instead, I urged my complaining little car at top speed to Corby and asked the first person I saw where Mrs. Broadwith was living. It was a tiny house, but attractive, and Mrs. Broadwith answered my knock herself. "Oh, come in, Mr. Herriot. It's right good of you to call." I went inside, and we sat facing each other across a scrubbed tabletop. "Well, it was sad about the old lady," she said. "Yes, I've only just heard. Any road she had a peaceful end. Just slept away at finish." "Well, I'm glad to hear that." Mrs. Broadwith looked round the room. "I was real lucky to get this place. It's just what I've always wanted." I could contain myself no longer. "Look, what's happened to the animals?" I blurted out. "Oh, they're in garden," she said calmly. "I've got a grand big stretch at the back." She got up and opened the door, and with a surge of relief I watched my old friends pour in. Arthur was on my knee in a flash, arching himself ecstatically against my arm while his outboard motor roared softly above the barking of the dogs. Prince, wheezy as ever, tail fanning the air, laughed at me delightedly between barks. "They look great, Mrs. Broadwith. How long are they going to be here?" "They're here for good. I think just as much of them as t'old lady ever did, and I couldn't be parted from them. They'll have a good home with me as long as they live." I looked at the typical Yorkshire country face, at the heavy cheeks with their grim lines belied by the kindly eyes. "Ah, this is wonderful," I said, "but won't you find it just a bit, expensive to feed them?" "Nay, you don't have to worry about that. I have a bit put by." "Well, fine. And I'll be looking in now and then to see how they are. I'm through the village every few days." I got up and started for the door. Mrs. Broadwith held up a hand. "There's just one thing I'd like you to do before they start selling off the things at the cottage. Would you please pop in and collect what's left of your medicines? They're in front room." I took the key and drove along to the other end of the village. As I pushed open the rickety gate and began to walk through the tangled grass, the front of the cottage looked strangely lifeless without the faces of the dogs at the window. And when the door creaked open and I went inside, the silence was like a heavy pall. Nothing had been moved. The bed with its rumpled blankets was still in the corner. I moved around, picking up half-empty bottles, a jar of ointment, a cardboard box with old Ben's tablets. A lot of good they'd done him. When I had got everything, I looked slowly round the little room. I wouldn't be coming here any more. And at the door I paused and read for the last time the card which hung over the empty bed. Chapter 44. I was spending Tuesday evening, as I spent all the Tuesday evenings, staring at the back of Helen Alderson's head at the Darrowby Music Society. It was a slow way of getting to know her better, but I had been unable to think of a better idea. Since the morning on the high moor when I'd set the calf's leg, I had scanned the day book regularly in the hope of having another visit to the farm. But the Aldersons seemed to have a lamentably healthy stock. I had to be content with the thought that there was the visit at the month's end to take off the plaster. The really crushing blow came when Helen's father rang up to say that since the calf was going sound, he had removed the plaster himself. He was pleased to say that the fracture had knitted perfectly and there was no sign of lameness. I had come to admire the self-reliance and initiative of the Dalesman, but I cursed it now at great length, and I joined the Music Society. I had seen Helen going into the schoolroom where the meetings were held, and with the courage of desperation had followed her inside. That was weeks ago, and I reflected miserably I had made no progress at all. I couldn't remember how many tenors, sopranos, and male voice choirs had come and gone, and on one occasion the local brass band had packed themselves into the little room and almost burst my eardrums, but I was no further forward. Tonight a string quartet was scraping away industriously, but I hardly heard them. My eyes, as usual, were focused on Helen, several rows in front of me, sitting between the two old ladies she always seemed to bring with her. That was part of the trouble. These two old ladies were always there, cutting out any chance of private conversation, even at the half-time break for tea. And there was the general atmosphere of the place. The members were nearly all elderly, and over everything hung the powerful schoolroom scent of ink and exercise books and chalk and lead pencils. It was the sort of place where you just couldn't say without warning, "Are you doing anything on Saturday night?" The scraping stopped and everybody clapped. The vicar got up from the front row and beamed on the company. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we might stop for 15 minutes, as I see our willing helpers have prepared tea. The price, as usual, is threepence." There was laughter and a general pushing back of chairs. I went to the back of the hall with the others, put my threepence on the plate, and collected a cup of tea and a biscuit. This was when I tried to get near Helen in the blind hope that something might happen. It wasn't always easy because I was often buttonholed by the school headmaster, and others who regarded a vet who liked music as an interesting curiosity. But tonight, I managed to edge myself as if by accident into her group. She looked at me over the top of her cup. "Good evening, Mr. Herriot. Are you enjoying it?" Oh, God, she always said that. And Mr. Herriot. But what could I do? Call me Jim would sound great. I replied as always, "Good evening, Miss Alderson. Yes. Very nice, isn't it?" Things were going with a bang again. I munched my biscuit while the old ladies talked about Mozart. It was going to be the same as all the other Tuesdays. It was about time I gave up the whole thing. I felt beaten. The vicar approached our group, still beaming. "I'm afraid I have to call on somebody for the washing-up rota. Perhaps our two young friends would take it on tonight." His friendly gaze twinkled from Helen to me and back again. The idea of washing up teacups had never held much attraction for me, but suddenly it was like sighting the promised land. "Yes, certainly. Delighted. Well, that is, if it's all right with Miss Alderson." Helen smiled. "Of course it's all right. We all have to take a turn, don't we?" I wheeled the trolley of cups and saucers into the scullery. It was a cramped, narrow place with a sink and a few shelves, and there was just about room for the two of us to get inside. "Would you like to wash or dry?" Helen asked. "I'll wash," I replied, and began to run hot water into the sink. It shouldn't be too difficult now, I thought, to work the conversation round to where I wanted it. I'd never have a better chance than now, jammed into this little room with Helen. But it was surprising how the time went by. 5 whole minutes and we hadn't talked about anything but music. With mounting frustration, I saw that we had nearly got through the pile of crockery and I had achieved nothing. The feeling changed to near panic when I lifted the last cup from the soapy water. It had to be now. I held out the cup to Helen, and she tried to take it from me, but I kept grip on the handle while I waited for inspiration. She pulled gently, but I clung to it tenaciously. It was developing into a tug-of-war. Then I heard a hoarse croak, which I only just recognized as my own voice. "Can I see you sometime?" For a moment she didn't answer, and I tried to read her face. Was she surprised, annoyed, even shocked? She flushed and replied, "If you like." I heard the croak again. Saturday evening?" She nodded, dried the cup, and was gone. I went back to my seat with my heart thudding. The strains of mangled Haydn from the quartet went unheeded. I had done it at last. But did she really want to come out? Had she been hustled into it against her will? My toes curled with embarrassment at the thought, but I consoled myself with the knowledge that for better or for worse, I was a step forward. Yes, I had done it at last. Chapter 45. As I sat at breakfast, I looked out at the autumn mist dissolving in the early sunshine. It was going to be another fine day, but there was a chill in the old house this morning. A shiveriness as though a cold hand had reached out to remind us that summer had gone and the hard months lay just ahead. "It says here," Siegfried said, adjusting his copy of the Darrowby and Hilton Times with care against the coffee pot, "that farmers have no feeling for their animals." I buttered a piece of toast and looked across at him. "Cruel, you mean?" "Well, not exactly, but this chap maintains that to a farmer livestock are purely commercial. There's no sentiment in his attitude towards them, no affection." Well, it wouldn't do if they were all like poor old Kit Bilton, would it? They'd all go mad. Kit was a lorry driver who, like so many of the working men of Darrowby, kept a pig at the bottom of his garden for family consumption. The snag was that when killing time came, Kit wept for 3 days. I happened to go into his house on one of these occasions and found his wife and daughter hard at it, cutting up the meat for pies and brawn. while Kit, huddled miserably by the kitchen fire, his eyes swimming with tears. He was a huge man who could throw a 12-stone sack of meal onto his wagon with a jerk of his arms. But he seized my hand in his and sobbed at me. "I can't bear it, Mr. Herriot. He was like a Christian, was that pig. Just like a Christian." "No, I agree." Siegfried leant over and sawed off a slice of Mrs. Hall's home-baked bread. "But Kit isn't a real farmer. This article is about people who own large numbers of animals. The question is it possible for such men to become emotionally involved? Can the dairy farmer, milking maybe 50 cows, become really fond of any of them, or are they just milk-producing units?" "Well, it's an interesting point," I said. "And I think you put your finger on it with the numbers. You know, there are a lot of our farmers up in the high country who have only a few stock, and they always have names for their cows, Daisy, Mabel. I even came across one called Kipperlugs the other day. I do think these small farmers have an affection for their animals, but I don't see how the big men can possibly have." Siegfried rose from the table and stretched luxuriously. "Well, you're probably right. Anyway, I'm sending you to see a really big man this morning. John Skipton of Dennerby Close. He's got some tooth rasping to do. Couple of old horses losing condition. You better take all the instruments, it might be anything." I went through to the little room down the passage and surveyed the tooth instruments. I always felt at my most medieval when I was caught up in large animal dentistry, and in the days of the draft horse it was a regular task. One of the commonest jobs was knocking the wolf teeth out of young horses. I have no idea how it got its name, but you found the little wolf tooth just in front of the molars, and if a young horse was doing badly, it always got the blame. It was no good the vets protesting that such a minute vestigial object couldn't possibly have any effect on the horse's health, and that the trouble was probably due to worms. The farmers were adamant. The tooth had to be removed. We did this by having the horse backed into a corner, placing the forked end of a metal rod against the tooth, and giving a sharp tap with an absurdly large wooden mallet. Since the tooth had no proper root, the operation was not particularly painful, but the horse still didn't like it. We usually had a couple of forefeet waving around our ears at each tap. And the annoying part was that after we had done the job and pointed out to the farmer that we had only performed a bit of black magic to humour him, the horse would take an immediate turn for the better and thrive consistently from then on. Farmers are normally reticent about our successful efforts, for fear we might put a little bit more on the bill, but in these cases they cast aside all caution. They would shout at us across the marketplace. "Hey, remember that horse you knocked wolf teeth out of? Well, he never looked back. It capped him." I looked again with distaste at the tooth instruments. The vicious forceps with 2-foot-long arms, sharp-jawed shears, mouth gags, hammers and chisels, files and rasps. It was rather like a quiet corner in the Spanish Inquisition. We kept a long wooden box with a handle for carrying the things, and I staggered out to the car with a fair selection. Dennerby Close was not just a substantial farm. It was a monument to a man's endurance and skill. The fine old house, the extensive buildings, the great sweep of lush grass land along the lower slopes of the fell were all proof that old John Skipton had achieved the impossible. He had started as an uneducated farm labourer, and he was now a wealthy landowner. The miracle hadn't happened easily. Old John had a lifetime of grinding toil behind him that would have killed most men. A lifetime with no room for a wife or family or creature comforts. But there was more to it than that. There was a brilliant acumen in agricultural matters that made the old man a legend in the district. "When all world goes one road, I go t'other," was one of his quoted sayings. And it is true that the Skipton farms had made money in the hard times when others were going bankrupt. Dennerby was only one of John's farms. He had 2 large arable places at about 400 acres, each lower down the dale. He had conquered, but to some people it seemed that he had himself been conquered in the process. He had battled against the odds for so many years and driven himself so fiercely that he couldn't stop. He could be enjoying all kinds of luxuries now, but he just hadn't the time. They said that the poorest of his workers lived in better style than he did. I paused as I got out of the car and stood gazing at the house as though I had never seen it before, and I marvelled again at the elegance which had withstood over 300 years of the harsh climate. People came a long way to see Denby Close, and take photographs of the graceful manor with its tall leaded windows, the massive chimneys towering over the old moss-grown tiles, or to wander through the neglected garden, and climb up the sweep of steps to the entrance with its wide stone arch over the great, studded door. There should have been a beautiful woman in one of those pointed hats peeping out from that mullioned casement, or a cavalier in ruffles and hose pacing beneath the high wall with its pointed copings. But there was just old John stumping impatiently towards me, his tattered, buttonless coat secured only by a length of binder twine round his middle. "Come on a minute, young man," he cried. "I've got a little bill to pay you." He led the way round to the back of the house, and I followed, pondering on the odd fact that he was always a little bill in Yorkshire. We went in through a flagged kitchen to a room which was graceful and spacious, but furnished only with a table, a few wooden chairs, and a collapsed sofa. The old man bustled over to the mantelpiece and fished out a bundle of papers from behind the clock. He leafed through them, threw an envelope onto the table, then produced a chequebook and slapped it down in front of me. I did the usual, took out the bill, made out the amount on the cheque, and pushed it over to him to sign. He wrote with a careful concentration, the small-featured, weathered face bent low, the peak of the old cloth cap almost touching the pen. His trousers had ridden up his legs as he sat down, showing the skinny calves and bare ankles. There were no socks underneath the heavy boots. When I had pocketed the cheque, John jumped to his feet. "We'll have to walk down to the river. Horses are down there." He left the house almost at a trot. I eased my box of instruments from the car boot. It was a funny thing, but whenever I had heavy equipment to lug about, my patients were always a long way away. This box seemed to be filled with lead, and it wasn't going to get any lighter on the journey down through the walled pastures. The old man seized a pitchfork, stabbed it into a bale of hay, and hoisted it effortlessly over his shoulder. He set off again at the same brisk pace. We made our way down from one gateway to another, often walking diagonally across the field. John didn't reduce speed, and I stumbled after him, puffing a little and trying to put away the thought that he was at least 50 years older than me. About halfway down, we came across a group of men at the age-old task of walling, repairing a gap in one of the dry stone walls which traced their patterns everywhere on the green slopes of the dales. One of the men looked up. "Nice morning, Mr. Skipton," he sang out cheerfully. "Buggart morning, get on with some work," grunted old John in reply, and the man smiled contentedly, as though he had received a compliment. I was glad when we reached the flat land at the bottom. My arms seemed to have stretched by several inches, and I could feel a trickle of sweat on my brow. Old John appeared unaffected. He flicked the fork from his shoulder, and the bale thudded onto the grass. The two horses turned towards us at the sound. They were standing fetlock deep in the pebbly shallows just beyond a little beach which merged into the green carpet of turf. Nose to tail, they had been rubbing their chins gently along each other's backs, unconscious of our approach. A high cliff overhanging the far bank made a perfect windbreak, while on either side of us clumps of oak and beech blazed in the autumn sunshine. "Well, they're in a nice spot, Mr. Skipton," I said. "Aye, they can keep cool in the hot weather, and they've got a barn when winter comes." John pointed to a low, thick-walled building with a single door. "They can come and go as they please." The sound of his voice brought the horses out of the river at a stiff trot, and as they came near you could see they really were old. The mare was a chestnut and the gelding was a light bay, but their coats were so flecked with grey that they almost looked like roans. This was most pronounced on their faces, where the sprinkling of white hairs, the sunken eyes, and the deep cavity above the eyes gave them a truly venerable appearance. For all that, they capered around John with a fair attempt at skittishness, stamping their feet, throwing their heads about, pushing his cap over his eyes with their muzzles. "Get by, leave off!" he shouted. "Daft old beggars!" But he tugged absently at the mare's forelock and ran his hand briefly along the neck of the gelding. "When did they last do any work?" I asked. "Oh, about 12 years ago, I reckon." I stared at John. 12 years? And have they been down here all that time?" "I just lacking about down here retard like. They've earned it and all." For a few moments he stood silent, shoulders hunched, hands deep in the pockets of his coat. Then he spoke quietly as if to himself. "They were 2 slaves when I was a slave." He turned and looked at me, and for a revealing moment I read in the pale blue eyes something of the agony and struggle he had shared with the animals. "But 12 years? How old are they anyway?" John's mouth twisted up at one corner. "Well, you're the vet. You tell me." I stepped forward confidently, my mind buzzing with Galvain's groove, shape of marks, degree of slope, and the rest. I grasped the unprotesting upper lip of the mare and looked at her teeth. "Good God!" I gasped. "I've never seen anything like this." The incisors were immensely long and projecting forward till they met at an angle of about 45 degrees. There were no marks at all. They had long since gone. I laughed and turned back to the old man. "It's no good. I'd only be guessing. You'll have to tell me." "Well, she's about 30 and Gelding's a year or 2 younger. She's had 15 grandfoals and never ailed out except a bit of teeth trouble. We've had them rast a time or two, and it's time they were being done again, I reckon. They're both losing ground and dropping bits of half-chewed hay from their mouths. Gelding's the worst, has a right job championing his grub." I put my hand into the mare's mouth, grasped her tongue, and pulled it out to one side. A quick exploration of the molars with my other hand revealed what I suspected. The outside edges of the upper teeth were overgrown and jagged and were irritating the cheeks, while the inside edges of the lower molars were in a similar state and were slightly excoriating the tongue. "I'll soon make her more comfortable, Mr. Skipton. With those sharp edges rubbed off, she'll be as good as new." I got the rasp out of my vast box, held the tongue in one hand, and worked the rough surface along the teeth, checking occasionally with my fingers till the points had been sufficiently reduced. "Wow, that's about right," I said after a few minutes. "I don't want to make them too smooth, or she won't be able to grind her food." John grunted. "Good enough. Now have a look at t'other. There's something far wrong with him." I had a feel at the gelding's teeth. "Just the same as the mare. Soon put him right, too." But pushing at the rasp, I had an uncomfortable feeling that something was not quite right. The thing wouldn't go fully to the back of the mouth. Something was stopping it. I stopped rasping and explored again, reaching with my fingers as far as I could. And I came upon something very strange, something which shouldn't have been there at all. It was like a great chunk of bone projecting down from the roof of the mouth. It was time I had a proper look. I took out my pocket torch and shone it over the back of the tongue. It was easy to see the trouble now. The last upper molar was overlapping the lower one, resulting in a gross overgrowth of the posterior border. The result was a saber-like barb about 3 inches long, stabbing down into the tender tissue of the gum. That would have to come off, right now. My jauntiness vanished and I suppressed a shudder. It meant using the horrible shears, those great long-handled things with the screw operated by a crossbar. They gave me the willies, because I am one of those people who can't bear to watch anybody blowing up a balloon, and this was the same sort of thing, only worse. You fastened the sharp blades of the shears onto the tooth and began to turn the bar slowly, slowly. Soon the tooth began to groan and creak under the tremendous leverage, and you knew that at any second it would break off, and that when it did, it was like somebody letting off a rifle in your ear. That was when all hell usually broke loose, but mercifully this was a quiet old horse, and I wouldn't expect him to start dancing around on his hind legs. There was no pain for the horse because the overgrown part had no nerve supply. It was the noise that caused the trouble. Returning to my crate, I produced this dreadful instrument, and with it a houseman's gag which I inserted onto the incisors and opened on its ratchet till the mouth gaped wide. Everything was easy to see then, and of course there it was. A great prong on the other side of the mouth, exactly like the first. Great. Great, now I had 2 to chop off. The old horse stood patiently, eyes almost closed, as though he had seen it all, and nothing in the world was going to bother him. I went through the motions with my toes curling, and when the sharp crack came, the white-bordered eyes opened wide, but only in mild surprise. He never even moved. When I did the other side, he paid no attention at all. In fact, with the gag prizing his jaws apart, he looked exactly as though he was yawning with boredom. As I bundled the tools away, John picked up the bony spicules from the grass and studied them with interest. "Well, poor old beggar. Good job I got you along, young man. Reckon he'll feel a lot better now." On the way back, old John, relieved of his bail, was able to go twice as fast, and he stumped his way up the hill at a furious pace, using the fork as a staff. I panted along in the rear, changing the box from hand to hand every few minutes. About halfway up, the thing slipped out of my grasp, and it gave me a chance to stop for a breather. As the old man muttered impatiently, I looked back and could just see the two horses. They had returned to the shallows and were playing together, chasing each other jerkily, their feet splashing in the water. The cliff made a dark backcloth to the picture, the shining river, the trees glowing bronze and gold, and the sweet green of the grass. Back in the farmyard, John paused awkwardly. He nodded once or twice, said, "Thank you, young man," then turned abruptly and walked away. I was dumping the box, thankfully, into the boot when I saw the man who had spoken to us on the way down. He was sitting cheerful as ever in a sunny corner, back against a pile of sacks, pulling his dinner packet from an old army satchel. "You've been down to see pensioners, then? By gor, how John should know the way." "Regular visitor, is he?" "Regular? Every day God sends you'll see our fella plodding down there. Rain, snow or blow, never misses, and always has somewhat with him, bag of corn, straw for their bedding." "And he's done that for 12 years? The man unscrewed his thermos flask and poured himself a cup of black tea. "Aye. Them horses haven't done a stroke of work all that time, and he could have got good money for them from the horse-flesh merchants. Rum 'un, isn't it?" "Yeah, you're right," I said. "It is a rum 'un." Just how rum it was occupied my thoughts on the way back to the surgery. I went back to my conversation with Siegfried that morning. We had just about decided that the man with a lot of animals couldn't be expected to feel affection for individuals among them. But those buildings back there were full of John Skipton's animals. He must have hundreds. Yet what made him trail down that hillside every day in all weathers? Why had he filled the last years of those two old horses with peace and beauty? Why had he given them a final ease and comfort which he had withheld from himself? It could only be love. Chapter 46. The longer I worked in Dannaby, the more the charms of the Dales beguiled me. And there was one solid advantage, of which I became more aware every day. The Dales farmers were all stocksmen. They really knew how to handle animals, and to a vet whose patients are constantly trying to thwart him or injure him, it was a particular blessing. So this morning I looked with satisfaction at the two men holding the cow. It wasn't a difficult job, just an intravenous injection of magnesium lactate. But still it was reassuring to have two such sturdy fellows to help me. Maurice Benison, medium-sized, but as tough as one of his own hill beasts, had a horn in his right hand while the fingers of his left gripped at the nose. I had the comfortable impression that the cow wouldn't jump very far when I pushed the needle in. His brother George, whose job it was to raise the vein, held the choke rope limply in enormous hands like bunches of carrots. He grinned down at me amiably from his 6'4". "Right, George," I said, "tighten up that rope and lean against the cow to stop her coming round on me." I pushed my way between the cow and her neighbour, past George's unyielding hulk, and bent over the jugular vein. It was standing out very nicely. I poised the needle, feeling the big man's elbow on me as I peered over my shoulder, and thrust quickly into the vein. "Lovely!" I cried as the dark blood fountained out and spattered quickly on the straw bedding beneath. "Slacken your rope, George." I fumbled in my pocket for the flutter valve. "And for God's sake, get your weight off me!" Because George had apparently decided to rest his full 14 stones on me instead of the cow, and as I tried desperately to connect the tube to the needle, I felt my knees giving way. I shouted again, despairingly, but he was inert, his chin resting on my shoulder, his breathing stertorous in my ear. There could only be one end to it. I fell flat on my face and lay there writhing under the motionless body. My cries went unheeded. George was unconscious. Mr. Benison, attracted by the commotion, came into the bar just in time to see me crawling out from beneath his eldest son. "Get him out, quick!" I gasped, "before the cows trample on him." Wordlessly, Morris and his father took an ankle apiece and hauled away in unison. George shot out from under the cows, his head beating a brisk tattoo on the cobbles, traversed the dung channel, then resumed his sleep on the bar floor. Mr. Benison moved back to the cow and waited for me to continue with my injection, but I found the presence of the sprawled body distracting. "Look, couldn't we sit him up against the wall and put his head between his legs?" I suggested apologetically. The others glanced at each other, then, as though deciding to humour me, grabbed George's shoulders and trundled him over the floor with the expertise of men used to throwing around bags of fertilizer and potatoes. But even propped against the rough stones, his head slumped forward and his great long arms hanging loosely, the poor fellow still didn't look so good. I couldn't help feeling a bit responsible. "Don't you think we might give him a drink?" But Mr. Benison had had enough. Nay, he'll be right. Just get on with job." Evidently he felt he had pampered George too much already. The incident started me thinking about this question of people's reactions to the sight of blood and other disturbing realities. Even though it was only my second year of practice, I had already formulated certain rules about this, and one was that it was always the biggest men who went down. I had by this time worked out a few other, perhaps unscientific, theories. E.g., big dogs were kept by people who lived in little houses and vice versa. Clients who said spare no expense never paid their bills, ever. When I asked my way in the Dales and was told you can't miss it, I knew I'd soon be hopelessly lost. I had begun to wonder if perhaps country folk, despite their closer contact with fundamental things, were perhaps more susceptible than city people. Ever since Sid Blenkhorn had staggered into Skeldale House one evening, his face was ghastly white, and he had obviously passed through a shattering experience. "Have you got a drop of whiskey handy, Jim?" he quavered. And when I had guided him to a chair and Siegfried had put a glass in his hand, he told us he had been at a first aid lecture given by Dr. Allinson a few doors down the street. "He was talking about veins and arteries and things," groaned Sid, passing a hand over his forehead. "God, it were awful." Apparently Fred Ellison, the fishmonger, had been carried out unconscious after only 10 minutes, and Sid himself had only just made it to the door. It had been a shambles. I was interested because this sort of thing I had found was always just round the corner. I suppose we must have more trouble in this way than the doctors, because in most cases, when our medical colleagues have any cutting or carving to do, they send their patients to hospital, while the vets just have to get their jackets off and operate on the spot. It means that the owners and attendants of the animals are pulled in as helpers and are subjected to some unusual sights. So, even in my short experience, I had become a fair authority on the various manifestations of coming over queer. I suppose it was a bit early to start compiling statistics, but I had never seen a woman or a little man pass out even though they might exhibit various shadings of the squeamish spectrum. The big chap was the best bet every time, especially the boisterous, super-confident type. I have a vivid recollection of a summer evening when I had to carry out a ruminotomy on a cow. As a rule, I was inclined to play for time when I suspected a foreign body. There were so many other conditions with similar symptoms that I was never in a hurry to make a hole in the animal's side. But this time, diagnosis was easy. The sudden fall in milk yield, loss of cudding, grunting, and the rigid sunken-eye appearance of the cow. And to clinch it, the farmer had told me he had been repairing a hen house in the cow pasture, nailing up loose boards. I knew where one of the nails had gone. The farm, right on the main street of the village, was a favourite meeting place for the local lads. As I laid out my instruments on a clean towel draped over a straw bale, a row of grinning faces watched from above the half-door of the box. Not only watched, but encouraged me with ribald shouts. When I was about ready to start, it occurred to me that an extra pair of hands would be helpful, and I turned to the door. "How would one of you lads like to be my assistant?" There was even more shouting for a minute or two, then the door was opened, and a huge young man with a shock of red hair ambled into the box. He was a magnificent sight, with his vast shoulders and the column of sunburnt neck rising from the open shirt. It needed only the bright blue eyes and the ruddy high cheekbone face to remind me that Norsemen had been around the Dales 1,000 years ago. This was a Viking. I had him roll up his sleeves and scrub his hands in a bucket of warm water and antiseptic, while I infiltrated the cow's flank with local anesthetic. When I gave him artery forceps and scissors to hold, he pranced around making stabbing motions at the cow and roaring with laughter. "Maybe you'd like to do the job yourself?" I asked. The Viking squared his great shoulders. "Aye, I'll have a go!" And the heads above the door cheered lustily. As I finally poised my Bard Parker scalpel with its new razor-sharp blade over the cow, the air was thick with earthy witticisms. I had decided that this time I really would make the bold incision recommended in the surgery books. It was about time I advanced upon the stage of pecking nervously at the skin. A veritable blow was how one learned author had described it. Well, that was how it was going to be. I touched the blade down on the clipped area of the flank, and with a quick motion of the wrist laid open a 10-inch wound. I stood back for a few seconds, admiring the clean-cut edges of the skin, with only a few capillaries spurting onto the glistening, twitching abdominal muscles. At the same time, I noticed that the laughter and shouting from the heads had been switched off, and was replaced by an eerie silence broken only by a heavy, thudding sound from behind me. "Forceps, please," I said, extending my hand back. But nothing happened. I looked round. The top of the half-door was bare, not a head in sight. There was only the Viking spread-eagled in the middle of the floor, arms and legs flung wide, chin pointing to the roof. The attitude was so theatrical that I thought he was still acting the fool. But a closer examination erased all doubts. The Viking was out cold. He must have gone straight over backwards like a stricken oak. The farmer, a bent little man who couldn't have scaled more than 8 stone, had been steadying the cow's head. He looked at me with the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Looks like you and me for it then, governor." He tied the halter to the ring on the wall, washed his hands methodically, and took up his place at my side. Throughout the operation he passed me my instruments, swabbed away the seeping blood, and clipped the sutures, whistling tunelessly through his teeth in a bored manner. The only time he showed any real emotion was when I produced the offending nail from the depths of the reticulum. He raised his eyebrows slightly, said, "Hello, hello," then started whistling again. We were too busy to do anything for the Viking. Halfway through, he sat up, shook himself a few times, then got to his feet and strode with elaborate nonchalance out of the box. The poor fellow seemed to be hoping that perhaps we had noticed nothing unusual. I don't suppose we could have done much to bring him round anyway. There was only one time I discovered a means of immediate resuscitation, and that was by accident. It was when Henry Dixon asked me to show him how to castrate a ruptured pig without leaving a swelling. Henry was going in for pigs in a big way, and had a burning ambition to equip himself with veterinary skills. When he showed me the young pig with the gross scrotal swelling, I demurred. "I really think this is a vet's job, Henry. Castrate your normal pigs by all means, but don't think you can make a proper job of this sort of thing." "How's that, then?" "Well, there's the local anaesthetic, danger of infection, and you really need a knowledge of anatomy to know what you're doing." All the frustrated surgeon in Henry showed in his eyes. "Go, I'd like to know how to do it." "I'll tell you what," I said. "How about if I do this one as a demonstration and you can make up your own mind? I'll give him a general anaesthetic so you don't have to hold him." "Right, that's a good idea." Henry thought for a moment. "What'll you charge me to do him?" 7 and 6. "Well, I suppose you have to have your pound of flesh. Get on." I injected a few cc's of Nembutal into the little pig's peritoneum, and after some staggering he rolled over in the straw and lay still. Henry had rigged up a table in the yard, and we laid the sleeping animal on it. I was preparing to start when Henry pulled out a 10-shilling note. "Better pay you now before I forget." "All right, but my hands are clean now. Push it into my pocket, and I'll give you the change when we finish." I rather fancied myself as a teacher, and soon warmed to my task. I carefully incised the skin over the inguinal canal, and pulled out the testicle intact in its tunics. "Now see here, Henry. The bowels have come down the canal and are lying in with the testicle. I pointed to the loops of intestine, pale pink through the translucent membranes. Now, if I do this, I can push them right back into the abdomen, and if I press here, out they pop again. You see how it works? See? They've gone. Now they're out again. Once more I make them disappear, and whoops, there they are back with us. Now, in order to retain them permanently in the abdomen, I take the spermatic cord and wind it in its coverings tightly down to the... But my audience was no longer with me. Henry had sunk down on an upturned oil drum and lay slumped across the table, his head cradled on his arms. My disappointment was acute, and finishing off the job and inserting the sutures was a sad anticlimax with my student slumbering at the end of the table. I put the pig back in his pen and gathered up my gear. Then I remembered I hadn't given Henry his change. I don't know why I did it, but instead of half a crown, I slapped down a shilling and sixpence on the wood a few inches from his face. The noise made him open his eyes, and he gazed dully at the coins for a few seconds. Then, with almost frightening suddenness, he snapped upright, ashen-faced but alert and glaring. "Hey!" he shouted. "I want another shilling!" Chapter 47. Vets are useless creatures. Parasites on the agricultural community. Expensive layabouts who really know nothing about animals or their diseases. You might as well get Jeff Mallock the Knacker Man as send for a vet. At least, that was the opinion frequently expressed of the Sidlow family. In fact, when you came right down to it, just about the only person for miles around who knew how to treat sick beasts was Mr. Sidlow himself. If any of their cows or horses fell ill, it was Mr. Sidlow who stepped forward with his armoury of sovereign remedies. He enjoyed a godlike prestige with his wife and large family, and it was an article of their faith that father was infallible in these matters. The only other being who ever approached his skill was long-dead Grandpa Sidlow, from whom father had learned so many of his cures. Mind you, Mr. Sidlow was a just and humane man. After maybe 5 or 6 days of dedicated nursing, during which he would perhaps push half a pound of lard and raisins down the cow's throat 3 times a day, rub its udder vigorously with turpentine, or maybe cut a bit off the end of the tail to let the bad out, he always, in the end, called the vet. Not that it would do any good, but he liked to give the animal every chance. When the vet arrived, he invariably found a sunken-eyed, dying creature, and the despairing treatment he gave was like a figurative administration of the last rites. The animal always died, so the Sidlows were repeatedly confirmed in their opinion. Vets were useless. The farm was situated outside the normal area of the practice, and we were the 3rd firm Mr. Sidlow had dealt with. He had been a client of Greer of Broughton, but had found him wanting, and moved to Wallace away over in Mansley. Wallace had disappointed him grievously, so he had decided to try Darrowby. He had been with us for over a year, but it was an uncomfortable relationship because Siegfried had offended him deeply on his very first visit. It was to a moribund horse, and Mr. Sidlow, describing the treatment to date, announced that he'd been pushing raw onions up the horse's rectum. He couldn't understand why it was so uneasy on its legs. Siegfried had pointed out that if he were to insert a raw onion in Mr. Sidlow's rectum, he, Mr. Sidlow, would undoubtedly be uneasy on his legs. It was a bad start, but there was really no other available vets left. He was stuck with us. I had been uncannily lucky in that I had been at Darrowby for more than a year and had never had to visit the farm. Mr. Sidlow rarely called us up during normal working hours, as, after wrestling with his conscience for a few days, he always seemed to lose the battle around 11 o'clock at night. He made exceptions in the case of the occasional Sunday afternoon, and it had always landed on Siegfried's duty nights. It was Siegfried who had trailed out, swearing quietly, and returned slightly pop-eyed in the small hours. So when it did finally come round to my turn, I didn't rush out with any great enthusiasm. even though the case was just a choking bullock and should present no difficulties. This was when a beast got a piece of turnip or potato stuck in its gullet, preventing regurgitation of gases and causing bloating which can be fatal. We usually either relieved the bloat by puncturing the stomach, or we carefully pushed the obstruction down into the stomach by means of a long, flexible leather instrument called a probang. Anyway, they had realized they couldn't wait for days this time, and by way of a change, it was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The farm was nearer Broughton than Darrowby, and lay in the low country down on the plain of York. I didn't like the look of the place. There was something depressing about the dilapidated brick buildings and the dreary setting of ploughing land, with only the occasional mound of a potato clamp to relieve the flatness. My first sight of Mr. Sidlow reminded me that he and his family were members of a fanatically narrow religious sect. I had seen this gaunt, blue-jowled face with the tortured eyes staring at me from the pages of history books long ago. I had the feeling that Mr. Sidlow would have burnt me at the stake without a qualm. The bullock was in a gloomy box off the fold yard. Several of the family had filed in with us. 2 young men in their 20s and 3 teenage girls, all good-looking in a dark, gypsy way, but all with the same taut, unsmiling look as their father. As I moved around, examining the animal, I noticed another peculiarity. They all looked at me, the bullock, each other, with quick sideways glances without any head movement. Nobody said anything. I would have liked to break the silence, but couldn't think of anything cheerful to say. This beast didn't have the look of an ordinary choke. I could feel the potato quite distinctly from the outside, halfway down the esophagus, but all around was an edematous mass extending up and down the left side of the neck. Not only that, but there was a bloody foam dripping from the mouth. There was something funny here. A thought struck me. "Have you been trying to push the potato down with something?" I could almost feel the battery of flittering glances, and the muscles of Mr. Sidlow's clenched jaw stood out in a twitching ridge. He swallowed carefully. "Aye. We've tried a bit." "What did you use?" Again the rippling jaw muscles under the dark skin. "Broom handle and a bit of hose pipe. Same as usual." That was enough. A sense of doom enveloped me. It would have been nice to be the first Met to make a good impression, but it wasn't to be. I turned to the farmer. "I'm afraid you've ruptured the gullet. It's a very delicate tube, you know, and you only have to push a bit too hard and you're through. You can see the fluid collection round the rupture." A quivering silence answered me. I ploughed on. "I've seen this happen before. It's a pretty black outlook." "All right," Mr. Sidlow ground out. "What are you going to do about it?" Well, we were at it now. What was I going to do about it? Maybe now, 30 years later, I might have tried to repair the gullet, packed the wound with antibiotic powder, and given a course of penicillin injections. But there, in that cheerless place, looking at the patient animal gulping painfully, coughing up the gouts of blood, I knew I was whacked. A ruptured esophagus was as near hopeless as anything could be. I searched my mind for a suitable speech. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sidlow, but I can't do anything about it." The glances crackled around me, and the farmer breathed in sharply through his nose. I didn't need to be told what they were all thinking. Another no-good, useless vet. I took a deep breath and continued. "Even if I shifted the potato, the wound would get contaminated when the beast tried to eat. He'd have a gangrene in no time, and that means a painful death. He's in pretty good condition. If I were you, I'd have him slaughtered immediately." The only reply was a virtuoso display from the jaw muscles. I tried another tack. "I'll give you a certificate. I'm sure the meat will pass for the butcher." No cries of joy greeted this remark. If anything, Mr. Sidlow's expression became still more bleak. "That beast isn't ready for killing yet," he whispered. "No, but you'll be sending him in before long. Another month, maybe." I'm sure you won't lose much. I tell you what, with a ghastly attempt at heartiness, if I can come into the house, I'll write you this chit now and we'll get the job over. There's really nothing else for it. I turned and headed across the fold yard for the farm kitchen. Mr. Sidlow followed wordlessly with the family. I wrote the certificate quickly, waves of disapproval washing around me in the silent room. As I folded the paper, I had the sudden conviction that Mr. Sidlow wasn't going to pay the slightest attention to my advice. He was going to wait a day or two to see how things turned out. The picture of the big, uncomprehending animal trying vainly to swallow as his hunger and thirst increased was too strong for me. I walked over to the phone on the windowsill. I'll just give Harry Norman a ring at the abattoir. I know he'll come straight up if I ask him. I made the arrangements, hung up the receiver, and started for the door, addressing Mr. Sidlow's profile as I left. It's fixed. Harry will be along within half an hour. Much better to get it done immediately. Going across the yard, I had to fight the impulse to break into a gallop. As I got into the car, I recalled Siegfried's advice. In sticky situations, always get the car backed round before you examine the animal. Leave the engine running if necessary. The quick getaway is essential. He was right. It took a long time reversing and manoeuvring under the battery of unseen eyes. I don't blush easily, but my face was burning as I finally left the farm. That was my first visit to the Sidlows, and I prayed that it would be my last. But my luck had run out. From then on, every time they sent for us, it just happened to be me on duty. I would rather not say anything about the cases I treated, except to record that something went wrong every time. The very name Sidlow became like a jinx. Try as I might, I couldn't do a thing right on that farm, so that within a short time I was firmly established with the family as the greatest menace to the animal population they had ever encountered. They didn't think much of vets as a whole, and they'd met some real beauties in their time, but I was by far the worst. My position as the biggest nincompoop of them all was unassailable. It got so bad that if I saw any Sidlows in the town, I would dive down an alley to avoid them, and one day in the marketplace I had the unnerving experience of seeing the entire family, somehow jammed into a large old car, passing within a few feet of me. Every face looked rigidly to the front, but every eye I knew was trained balefully on me. Fortunately, I was just outside the drover's arms, so I was able to reel inside and steady myself with a half-pint of Younger's Special Heavy. However, the Sidlows were far from my mind on the Saturday morning when Siegfried asked me if I would go through and officiate at Broughton races. "They've asked me to do it as Greer is on holiday," he said. "But I'd already promised to go through to Casborough to help Dick Henley with a rig operation. I can't let him down. There's nothing much to the race job. The regular course vet will be there and he'll keep you right." He hadn't been gone more than a few minutes when there was a call from the racecourse. One of the horses had fallen while being unloaded from its box and had injured its knee. Would I come right away? Even now I am no expert on racehorses. They form a little branch of practice all by itself, with its own stresses, its own mystique. In my short spell in Darrowby, I had had very little to do with them, as Siegfried was fascinated by anything equine and usually gobbled up anything in that line which came along. So my practical experience was negligible. I wasn't at all reassured when I saw my patient. The knee was a terrible mess. He had tripped at the bottom of the ramp and come down with his full weight on the stony ground. The lacerated skin hung down in bloody ribbons, exposing the joint capsule over an area of about 6 inches, and the extensor tendons gleamed through a tattered layer of fascia. The beautiful 3-year-old held the limb up, with the toe just touching the ground. The ravaged knee made a violent contrast with the sleek, carefully groomed coat. Examining the wound, gently feeling round the joint, I was immediately thankful for one thing. It was a quiet animal. Some light horses are so highly strung that the slightest touch sends them up in the air, but this one hardly moved as I tried to piece together the jigsaw of skin pieces. Another lucky break. There was nothing missing. I turned to the stable lad, small, square, hands deep in his coat pockets, who was standing watching. "I'll clean up the wound and stitch it, but he'll need some expert care when you get him home. Can you tell me who'll be treating him?" Yes, sir. Mr. Brayley Reynolds. He'll have charge of him." I came bolt upright from my crouching position. The name was like a trumpet call echoing down from my student days. When you talked about horses, you usually talked about Brayley Reynolds sooner or later. I could imagine the great man inspecting my handiwork. "And who did you say treated this horse? Herriot? Herriot?" I got down to the job again with my heart beating faster. Mercifully, the joint capsule and tendon sheaths were undamaged. No escape of synovia. Using a solution of chinosol, I swabbed out every last cranny of the wound till the ground around me was white with cotton wool plagets. Then I puffed in some iodoform powder and tacked down the loose shreds of fascia. Now the thing was to make a really good job of the skin to avoid disfigurement if possible. I chose some fine silk and a very small suture needle and squatted down again. I must have stayed there for nearly an hour, pulling the flaps of skin carefully into position and fastening them down with innumerable tiny sutures. There is a fascination in the repairing of a ragged wound, and I always took pains over it even without an imaginary Brayley Reynolds peering over my shoulder. When I finally straightened up, I did so slowly, like an old man easing the kinks from neck and back. With shaking knees, I looked down at the head lad almost without recognition. He was smiling. "You've made a proper job of that," he said. "It looks nearly good as new." "I want to thank you, sir. He's one of my favourites, not just because he's a good hoss, but he's kind." He patted the 3-year-old's flank. "Well, I hope he does all right." I got out a packet of gauze and a bandage. "I'm just going to cover the knee with this, and then you can put on a stable bandage. I'll give him a shot against tetanus, and that's it." I was packing my gear away in the car when the head lad hovered again at my side. "Do you back horses?" I laughed. "No, hardly ever. Don't know much about it." "Well, never mind." The little man looked round him and lowered his voice. "But I'll tell you something to back this afternoon. Camel, in the first race. He's one of ours and he's going to win. You'll get a nice price about him." "Well, thanks. It'll give me something to do. I'll have £0.50 on him." The tough little face screwed up in disgust. No, put a £5 on him." He walked rapidly away. I don't know what madness took hold of me, but by the time I got back to Dannerby, I had decided to take his advice. There had been something compelling about that last hoarse whisper and the utter confidence in the black pebble eyes. The little chap was trying to do me a good turn. I had noticed him glancing at my old jacket and rumpled flannels, so different from the natty outfit of the typical horse vet. Maybe he thought I needed the money. I dropped in at the Midland Bank and drew out £5, which at the time represented approximately half my available capital. I hurried round the remaining visits, had a quick lunch, and got into my best suit. There was plenty of time to get to the course, meet the officials, and get my £5 on Kemmel before the first race at 2:30. The phone rang just as I was about to leave the house. It was Mr. Sidlow. He had a scouring cow which needed attention immediately. It was fitting, I thought dully, that in my moment of eager anticipation, it should be my old Jinx who should stretch out his cold hand and grasp me. And it was Saturday afternoon. That was fitting too. But I shook myself. The farm was near Broughton, and it shouldn't take too long to deal with a scouring cow. I could still make it. When I arrived, my immaculate appearance set up an immediate flurry of oblique glances among the assembled family, while Mr. Sidlow's rigid lips and square shoulders bore witness that he was prepared to endure another visit from me with courage. A numbness filled me as we went into the byre. It continued as Mr. Sidlow described how he had battled against this cow's recurring bouts of diarrhea for several months, how he had started quietly with ground eggshells in gruel and worked up to his most powerful remedy, blue vitriol and dandelion tea, but all to no avail. I hardly heard him, because it was fairly obvious at a glance that the cow had Yona's disease. Nobody could be quite sure, of course, but the animal's advanced emaciation, especially in the hind end, and the stream of bubbly, fetid scar which she had ejected as I walked in were almost diagnostic. Instinctively, I grasped her tail and thrust my thermometer into the rectum. I wasn't much interested in her temperature, but it did give me a couple of minutes to think. However, in this instance, I only had about 5 seconds because without warning the thermometer disappeared from my fingers. Some sudden suction had drawn it inside the cow. I ran my fingers around just inside the rectum. Nothing. I pushed my hand inside without success. With a feeling of rising panic, I rolled up my sleeve and groped about in vain. There was nothing else for it. I had to ask for a bucket of hot water, soap and a towel, and strip off as though preparing for some large undertaking. Over my 30-odd years in practice, I can recall many occasions when I looked a complete fool. But there is a peculiarly piercing quality about the memory of myself, bare to the waist, the centre of a ring of hostile stares, guddling frantically inside that cow. At the time, all I could think of was that this was the Sidlow place. Anything could happen here. In my mental turmoil, I had discarded all my knowledge of pathology and anatomy, and could visualize the little glass tube working its way rapidly along the intestinal tract until it finally pierced some vital organ. There was another hideous image of myself carrying out a major operation, a full-scale laparotomy on the cow to recover my thermometer. It is difficult to describe the glorious relief which flooded through me when at last I felt the thing between my fingers. I pulled it out, filthy and dripping, and stared down stupidly at the graduations on the tube. Mr. Sidlow cleared his throat. Well, what does it say? Has she got a temperature? I whipped round and gave him a piercing look. Was it possible that this man could be making a joke? But the dark, tight-shut face was expressionless. No, I mumbled in reply. No temperature. The rest of that visit has always been mercifully blurred in my mind. I know I got myself cleaned up and dressed and told Mr. Sidlow that I thought his cow had Eunice's disease, which was incurable, but I would take away a feces sample to try to make sure. The details are cloudy, but I do know that at no point was there the slightest gleam of light or hope. I left the farm, bowed down by an ever greater sense of disgrace than usual, and drove with my foot on the boards all the way to Broughton. I roared into the special car park at the racecourse, galloped through the owners' and trainers' entrance, and seized the arm of the gatekeeper. "Has the first race been run?" I gasped. "I just finished," he replied cheerfully. "Kemmel won it, 10-1. I turned and walked slowly towards the paddock. £50. A fortune snatched from my grasp by cruel fate. And hanging over the whole tragedy was the grim spectre of Mr. Sidlow. I could forgive Mr. Sidlow, I thought, for dragging me out at all sorts of ungodly hours. I could forgive him for presenting me with a long succession of hopeless cases, which had lowered my self-esteem to rock bottom. I could forgive him for thinking I was the biggest idiot in Yorkshire, and for proclaiming his opinion far and wide. But I'd never forgive him for losing me that £50. Chapter 48. The Reniston, eh? I fidgeted uneasily. Bit grand, isn't it? Tristan lay rather than sat in his favourite chair, and peered out through a cloud of cigarette smoke. Well, of course it's grand. It's the most luxurious hotel in the country outside of London, but for your purpose, it's the only possible place. Look, tonight is your big chance, isn't it? And you want to impress the girl, don't you? Well, ring her up and tell her you're taking her to the Reniston. The food is wonderful, and there's a dinner dance every Saturday night, and today is Saturday. He sat up suddenly and his eyes widened. Can't you see it, Jim? The music oozing out of Benny Thornton's trombone, and you, full of lobster thermidor, floating round the floor with Helen snuggling up to you. The only snag is that it will cost you a packet. But if you're prepared to spend about a fortnight's wages, you can have a really good night. I hardly heard the last part. I was concentrating on the blinding vision of Helen snuggling up to me. It was an image which blotted out things like money, and I stood with my mouth half open, listening to the trombone. I could hear it quite clearly. Tristan broke in. "There's one thing. Have you got a dinner jacket? You'll need one." "Well, I'm not very well off for evening dress. In fact, when I went to Mrs. Pumphrey's party, I hired a suit from Broughton, but I wouldn't have time for that now." I paused and thought for a moment. "I do have my first and only dinner suit, but I got it when I was about 17. And I don't know whether I'd be able to get into it now." Tristan waved this aside. He dragged the woodbine smoke into the far depths of his lungs and released it reluctantly in little wisps and trickles as he spoke. "Doesn't matter in the least, Jim. As long as you're wearing the proper gear, they'll let you in. And with a big, good-looking chap like you, the fit of the suit is unimportant." We went upstairs and extracted the garment from the bottom of my trunk. I had cut quite a dash in this suit at the college dances, and though it had got very tight towards the end of the course, it had still been a genuine evening dress outfit, and as such had commanded a certain amount of respect. But now it had a pathetic lost look. The fashion had changed, and the trend was towards comfortable jackets and soft, unstarched shirts. This one was rigidly of the old school, and included an absurd little waistcoat with lapels and a stiff, shiny-fronted shirt with a tall, winged collar. My problems really started when I got the suit on. Hard work, Pennine air, and Mrs. Hall's good food had filled me out, and the jacket failed to meet across my stomach by 6 inches. I seemed to have got taller, too, because there was a generous space between the bottom of the waistcoat and the top of the trousers. The trousers themselves were skin-tight over the buttocks, yet seemed foolishly baggy lower down. Tristan's confidence evaporated as I paraded before him, and he decided to call on Mrs. Hall for advice. She was an unemotional woman and endured the irregular life at Scaledale House without noticeable reaction. But when she came into the bedroom and looked at me, her facial muscles went into a long, twitching spasm. She finally overcame the weakness, however, and became very businesslike. "Well, a little gusset at the back of your trousers will work wonders, Mr. Herriot. And I think if I put a bit of silk cord across the front of your jacket, it'll hold it nicely. Mind you, there'll be a bit of space, but I shouldn't think that'll worry you. And I'll give the whole suit a good press. Makes all the difference in the world." I had never gone in much for intensive grooming, but that night I really went to work on myself, scrubbing and anointing and trying a whole series of different partings in my hair before I was satisfied. Tristan seemed to have appointed himself master of the wardrobe, and he carried the suit tenderly upstairs, still warm from Mrs. Hall's ironing board. Then, like a professional valet, he assisted in every step of the robing. The high collar gave the most trouble, and he drew strangled oaths from me as he trapped the flesh of my neck under the stud. When I was finally arrayed, he walked around me several times, pulling and patting the material and making delicate adjustments here and there. Eventually he stopped his circling and surveyed me from the front. I had never seen him look so serious. "Fine, Jim. Fine. You look great. Distinguished, you know. It's not everybody who can wear a dinner jacket. So many people look like conjurers, but not you. Hang on a minute, and I'll get your overcoat." I had arranged to pick up Helen at 7 o'clock, and as I climbed from the car in the darkness outside her house, a strange unease crept over me. This was different. When I had come here before, it had been as a veterinary surgeon. The man who knew, who was wanted, who came to render assistance in time of need. It had never occurred to me how much this affected my outlook every time I walked onto a farm. This wasn't the same thing at all. I had come to take this man's daughter out. He might not like it. Might positively resent it. Standing outside the farmhouse door, I took a deep breath. The night was very dark and still. No sound came from the great trees nearby, and only the distant roar of the Darrow disturbed the silence. The recent heavy rains had transformed the leisurely wandering river into a rushing torrent, which in places overflowed its banks and flooded the surrounding pastures. I was shown into the large kitchen by Helen's young brother. The boy had a hand over his mouth in an attempt to hide a wide grin. He seemed to find the situation funny. His little sister, sitting at a table doing her homework, was pretending to concentrate on her writing, but she too wore a fixed smirk as she looked down at her book. Mr. Alderson was reading The Farmer and Stockbreeder. His breeches unlaced, his stockinged feet stretched out towards a blazing pile of logs. He looked up over his spectacles. "Come in, young man, and sit by the fire," he said absently. I had the uncomfortable impression that it was a frequent and boring experience for him to have young men calling for his eldest daughter. I sat down at the other side of the fire, and Mr. Alderson resumed his study of The Farmer and Stockbreeder. The ponderous tick-tock of a large wall clock boomed out into the silence. I stared into the red depths of the fire till my eyes began to ache. Then I looked up at a big oil painting in a gilt frame hanging above the mantelpiece. It depicted shaggy cattle standing knee-deep in a lake of an extraordinary bright blue. Behind them loomed a backcloth of fearsome, improbable mountains, their jagged summits wreathed in a sulphurous mist. Averting my eyes from this, I examined one by one the sides of bacon and the hams hanging from the rows of hooks in the ceiling. Mr. Alderson turned over a page. The clock ticked on. Over by the table, spluttering noises came from the children. After about a year, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Then Helen came into the room. She was wearing a blue dress, the kind without shoulder straps that seemed to stay out by magic. Her dark hair shone under the single pressure lamp which lit the kitchen, overshadowing the soft curves of her neck and shoulders. Over one white arm she held a camel hair coat. I felt stunned. She was like a rare jewel in the rough setting of stone flags and whitewashed walls. She gave me her quiet, friendly smile and walked towards me. "Hello. I hope I haven't kept you waiting too long." I muttered something in reply and helped her on with the coat. She bent over and kissed her father, who didn't look up but waved his hand vaguely. There was another outburst of giggling from the table. We went out. In the car I felt unusually tense, and for the first mile or two had to depend on some inane remarks about the weather to keep the conversation going. I was beginning to relax when I drove over a little humpbacked bridge into a dip in the road. Then the car suddenly stopped. The engine coughed gently, and then we were sitting silent and motionless in the darkness. And there was something else. My feet and ankles were freezing cold. "Oh, my God!" I shouted. "We've run into a bit of flooded road. The water's right into the car." I looked round at Helen. "I'm terribly sorry about this. Your feet must be soaked." But Helen was laughing. She had her feet tucked up on the seat, her knees under her chin. "Well, yes, I am a bit wet, but it's no good sitting about like this. Hadn't we better start pushing?" Wading out into the black, icy waters was a nightmare, but there was no escape. Mercifully, it was a little car, and between us we managed to push it beyond the flooded patch. Then by torchlight I dried the plugs and got the engine going again. Helen shivered as we squelched back into the car. "I'm afraid I'll have to go back and change my shoes and stockings. And so will you. There's another road back through Fensley. You take the first turn on the left." Back at the farm, Mr. Alderson was still reading The Farmer and Stockbreeder, and kept his finger on the list of pig prices while he gave me a baleful glance over his spectacles. When he learned that I had come to borrow a pair of his shoes and socks, he threw the paper down in exasperation and rose, groaning from his chair. He shuffled out of the room, and I could hear him muttering to himself as he mounted the stairs. Helen followed him, and I was left alone with the two young children. They studied my sodden trousers with undisguised delight. I had wrung most of the surplus water out of them, but the final result was remarkable. Mrs. Hall's knife-edge creases reached just below the knee, but then there was chaos. The trousers flared out at that point in a crumpled, shapeless mass, and as I stood by the fire to dry them, a gentle steam rose about me. The children stared at me, wide-eyed and happy. This was a big night for them. Mr. Alderson reappeared at length and dropped some shoes and rough socks at my feet. I pulled on the socks quickly but shrank back when I saw the shoes. They were a pair of dancing slippers from the early days of the century, and their cracked patent leather was topped by wide, black silk bows. I opened my mouth to protest, but Mr. Alderson had dug himself deep into his chair and had found his place again among the pig prices. I had the feeling that if I asked for another pair of shoes, Mr. Ollison would attack me with a poker. I put the slippers on. We had to take a roundabout road to avoid the floods, but I kept my foot down, and within half an hour we had left the steep sides of the dale behind us and were heading out onto the rolling plain. I began to feel better. We were making good time, and the little car, shuddering and creaking, was going well. I was just thinking that we wouldn't be all that late when the steering wheel began to drag to one side. I had a puncture most days, and recognized the symptoms immediately. I had become an expert at changing wheels, and with a word of apology to Helen, was out of the car like a flash. With my rapid manipulation of the rusty jack and brace, the wheel was off within 3 minutes. The surface of the crumpled tyre was quite smooth except for the lighter frayed parts where the canvas showed through. Working like a demon, I screwed on the spare, cringing inwardly as I saw that this tyre was in exactly the same condition as the other. I steadfastly refused to think of what I would do if its frail fibres should give up the struggle. By day, the Reniston dominated Broughton like a vast medieval fortress, bright flags fluttering arrogantly from its 4 turrets. But tonight, it was like a dark cliff, with a glowing cavern at street level where the Bentleys discharged their expensive cargoes. I didn't take my vehicle to the front entrance, but tucked it away quietly at the back of the car park. A magnificent commissionaire opened the door for us, and we trod noiselessly over the rich carpeting of the entrance hall. We parted there to get rid of our coats, and in the men's cloakroom I scrubbed frantically at my oily hands. It didn't do much good. Changing that wheel had given my fingernails a border of deep black which defied ordinary soap and water, and Helen was waiting for me. I looked up in the mirror at the white-jacketed attendant hovering behind me with a towel. The man, clearly fascinated by my ensemble, was staring down at the wide-bowed Pierrot shoes and the rumpled trouser-bottoms. As he handed over the towel, he smiled broadly, as if in gratitude for a little bit of extra colour in his life. I met Helen in the reception hall, and we went over to the desk. "What time does the dinner dance start?" I asked. The girl at the desk looked surprised. "I'm sorry, sir, there's no dance tonight. We only have them once a fortnight." I turned to Helen in dismay, but she smiled encouragingly. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I don't really care what we do." "We can have dinner anyway," I said. I tried to speak cheerfully, but a little black cloud seemed to be forming just above my head. Was anything going to go right tonight? I could feel my morale slumping as I padded over the lush carpet, and my first sight of the dining room didn't help. It looked as big as a football field, with great marble pillars supporting a carved, painted ceiling. The Reniston had been built in the late Victorian period, and all the opulence and ornate splendour of those days had been retained in this tremendous room. Most of the tables were occupied by the usual clientele, a mixture of the county aristocracy and industrialists from the West Riding. I had never seen so many beautiful women and masterful-looking men under one roof, and I noticed with a twinge of alarm that though the men were wearing everything from dark lounge suits to hairy tweeds, there wasn't another dinner jacket in sight. A majestic figure in white tie and tails bore down on us. With his mane of white hair falling back from the lofty brow, the bulging waistline, the hooked nose and imperious expression, he looked exactly like a Roman emperor. His eyes flickered expertly over me, and he spoke tonelessly. "You want a table, sir?" Yes, please," I mumbled, only just stopping myself from saying sir to the man in return. "A table for 2. "Are you staying, sir?" This question baffled me. How could I possibly have dinner if I wasn't staying? "Yes, I am staying." The Emperor made a note on a pad. "This way, sir." He began to make his way with great dignity among the tables, while I followed abjectly in his wake with Helen. It was a long way to the table, and I tried to ignore the heads which turned to have a second look at me as I passed. It was Mrs. Hall's gusset that worried me most, and I imagined it standing out like a beacon below the short jacket. It was literally burning my buttocks by the time we arrived. The table was nicely situated, and a swarm of waiters descended on us, pulling out our chairs and settling us into them, shaking out our napkins and spreading them on our laps. When they had dispersed, the Emperor took charge again. He poised a pencil over his pad. "May I have your room number, sir?" I swallowed hard and stared up at him over my dangerously billowing shirt front. "Room number? Oh, I'm not living in the hotel." "Ah, not staying." He fixed me for a moment with an icy look before crossing out something on the pad with unnecessary violence. He muttered something to one of the waiters and strode away. It was about then that the feeling of doom entered into me. The black cloud over my head spread and descended, enveloping me in a dense cloud of misery. The whole evening had been a disaster and would probably get worse. I must have been mad to come to this sumptuous place dressed up like a knockabout comedian. I was as hot as hell inside the ghastly suit, and the stud was biting viciously into my neck. I took a menu card from the waiter and tried to hold it with my fingers curled inwards to hide my dirty nails. Everything was in French, and in my numbed state the words were largely meaningless. But somehow I ordered the meal, and as we ate, I tried desperately to keep the conversation going. But long deserts of silence began to stretch between us. It seemed that only Helen and I were quiet among all the surrounding laughter and chatter. Worst of all was the little voice which kept telling me that Helen had never really wanted to come out with me anyway. She had done it out of politeness and was getting through a boring evening as best she could. The journey home was a fitting climax. We stared straight ahead as the headlights picked out the winding road back into the dales. We made stumbling remarks, then the strained silence took over again. By the time we drew up outside the farm, my head had begun to ache. We shook hands, and Helen thanked me for a lovely evening. There was a tremor in her voice, and in the moonlight her face was anxious and withdrawn. I said good night, got into the car, and drove away. Chapter 49. If only my car had had any brakes, I would certainly have enjoyed looking down on Wharton village from the high moor. The old stone houses, straggling unevenly along the near bank of the river, made a pleasant splash of grey on the green floor of the valley, and the little gardens with their clipped lawns gave a touch of softness to the bare, rising sweep of the fellside on the other side of the dale. But the whole scene was clouded by the thought that I had to get down that road with its 1 in 4 gradient and those 2 villainous S-bends. It was like a malevolent snake crawling almost headlong from where I sat, and as I said, I had no brakes. Of course, the vehicle had originally been fitted with the means of bringing it to a halt, and during most of the year I had ridden in it, a violent pressure on the pedal would have the desired effect, even though it caused a certain amount of veering about on the road. But lately, the response had been growing weaker, and now it was nil. During the gradual deterioration, I had brought the matter up with Siegfried now and then, and he'd expressed sympathy and concern. "Well, that won't do at all, James. I'll have a word with Hammond about it. Leave it to me." And then, a few days later, when I made a further appeal, "Oh, Lord, yes. I've been meaning to fix it up with Hammond. Don't worry, James. I'll see to it." Finally, I had to tell him that when I put my foot on the pedal, there was nothing at all, and the only way I had of stopping the car was to crash it into bottom gear. "Oh, God, bad luck, James. Must be a nuisance for you. But never mind, I'll arrange everything." Sometime later, I asked Mr. Hammond down at the garage if he'd heard anything from Siegfried, but he hadn't. The motorman did, however, hop into the car and drive it slowly down the street. He came to a jerking, shuddering halt about 50 yards away, and then got out. He made no attempt to back up, but walked thoughtfully towards me. Normally an imperturbable man, he had gone rather pale, and looked at me wonderingly. "And you mean to tell me, lad, that you do all your rounds in that car?" "Well, yes, I do." "You ought to have a medal, then. I dursn't drive across Market-place in that bloody thing." There wasn't much I could do. The car was Siegfried's property, and I'd have to await his pleasure. Of course, I had had experience of this sort of thing before, in the shape of the movable passenger seat he had in his own vehicle when I first came to Darrowby. He never seemed to notice when I went over backwards every time I sat in it. and I don't suppose he ever would have done anything about it but for an incident one market day, when he noticed an old lady with a large basket of vegetables walking into Darrowby, and courteously offered her a lift. Poor old girl's feet went straight up in the air, and she just disappeared into the back. Had a hell of a job getting her out. Thought we'd have to get a block and tackle. Cabbages and cauliflowers rolling all over the place. I looked again down the steep track. The sensible thing, of course, would be to go back into Darrowby and take the low road into Wharton. No danger that way. But it meant a round trip of nearly 10 miles, and I could actually see the small holding I wanted to visit just 1,000 feet below. The calf with joint ill was in that shed with the green door. In fact, there was old Mr. Robinson coming out of the house now, and pottering across the yard with a bucket. I could almost reach out and touch him. I thought, not for the first time, that if you had to drive a car with no brakes, one of the last places in England you'd want to be was the Yorkshire Dales. Even on the flat it was bad enough. But I got used to it after a week or two and often forgot all about it. As when one day I was busy with a cow and the farmer jumped into my car to move it so that one of his men could get past with a tractor. I never said a word as the unsuspecting man backed round quickly and confidently and hit the wall of the barn with a sickening crash. With typical Yorkshire understatement, all he said was, "Your brakes aren't our savage, mister." Anyway, I had to make up my mind. Was it to be back to Darrowby or straight over the top? It had become a common situation, and every day I had the experience of sitting wrestling with myself on the edge of a hill with my heart thumping as it was now. There must have been scores of these unwitnessed dramas played out in the green silence of the fells. At last, I started the engine and did what I always did. Took the quick way down. But this hill really was a beauty. A notorious road even in this country, and as I nosed gingerly onto it, the whole world seemed to drop away from me. With the gear lever in bottom and my hand jammed against it, I headed, dry-mouthed, down the strip of tarmac, which now looked to be almost vertical. It is surprising what speed you can attain in bottom gear if you have nothing else to hold you back, and as the first bend rushed up at me, the little engine started a rising scream of protest. When I hit the curve, I hauled the wheel round desperately to the right, the tyre spun for a second in the stones and loose soil of the verge, and we were off again. This was a longer stretch, and even steeper, and it was like being on the Big Dipper with the same feeling of lack of control over one's fate. Hurtling into the bend, the idea of turning at this speed was preposterous, but it was that or straight over the edge. Terror-stricken, I closed my eyes and dragged the wheel to the left. This time, one side of the car lifted, and I was sure we were over. Then it rocked back onto the other side, and for a horrible second or two kept this up, till it finally decided to stay upright, and I was once more on my way. Again, a yawning gradient. But as the car sped downwards, engine howling, I was aware of a curious numbness. I seemed to have reached the ultimate limits of fear, and I hardly noticed as we shot round the third bend. One more to go, and at last the road was levelling out. My speed dropped rapidly, and at the last bend I couldn't have been doing more than 20. I had made it. It wasn't till I was right onto the final straight that I saw the sheep. Hundreds of them, filling the road. A river of woolly backs lapping from wall to wall. They were only yards from me, and I was still going downhill. Without hesitation, I turned and drove straight into the wall. There didn't seem to be much damage. A few stones slithered down as the engine stalled and fell silent. Slowly, I sank back in my seat, relaxing my clenched jaws, releasing finger by finger the fierce grip on the wheel. The sheep continued to flow past, and I took a sideways glance at the man who was shepherding them. He was a stranger to me, and I prayed he didn't recognize me either, because at that moment the role of unknown madman seemed to be the ideal one. Best not to say anything. Appearing round a corner and driving deliberately into a wall is no basis for a rewarding conversation. The sheep were still passing by, and I could hear the man calling to his dogs. "Get by, Jess. Come by, Nell." But I kept up a steady stare at the layered stones in front of me, even though he passed within a few feet. I suppose some people would have asked me what the hell I was playing at, but not a Dale shepherd. He went quietly by without invading my privacy, But when I looked in the mirror after a few moments, I could see him in the middle of the road staring back at me, his sheep temporarily forgotten. My breakless period has always been easy to recall. There is a piercing clarity about the memory which has kept it fresh over the years. I suppose it lasted only a few weeks, but it could have gone on indefinitely if Siegfried himself hadn't become involved. It was when we were going to a case together. For some reason, he decided to take my car and settled in the driver's seat. I huddled apprehensively next to him as he set off at his usual brisk pace. Hinchcliffe's farm lies about a mile on the main road outside Darrowby. It is a massive place with a wide, straight drive leading down to the house. We weren't going there, but as Siegfried spurted to full speed, I could see Mr. Hinchcliffe in his big Buick ahead of us, proceeding in a leisurely way along the middle of the road. As Siegfried pulled out to overtake, the farmer suddenly stuck out his hand and began to turn right towards his farm, directly across our path. Siegfried's foot went hard down on the brake pedal and his eyebrows shot up as nothing happened. We were going straight for the side of the Buick, and there was no room to go round to the left. Siegfried didn't panic. At the last moment, he turned right with the Buick, and the two cars roared side by side down the drive, Mr. Hinchcliffe staring at me with bulging eyes from close range. The farmer stopped in the yard, but we continued round the back of the house, because we had to. Fortunately, it was one of those places where you could drive right round, and we rattled through the stackyard and back to the front of the house behind Mr. Hinchcliffe, who had got out and was looking round the corner to see where we had gone. The farmer whipped round in astonishment, and open-mouthed watched us as we passed, but Siegfried, retaining his aplomb to the end, inclined his head and gave a little wave before we shot back up the drive. Before we returned to the main road, I had a look back at Mr. Hinchcliffe. He was still watching us, and there was a certain rigidity in his pose which reminded me of the shepherd. Once on the road, Siegfried steered carefully into a lay-by and stopped. For a few moments he stared straight ahead without speaking, and I realized he was having a little difficulty in getting his patient look properly adjusted. But when he finally turned to me, his face was transfigured, almost saintly. I dug my nails into my palms as he smiled at me with kind eyes. "Really, James, I can't understand why you keep things to yourself. Heaven knows how long your car has been in this condition, yet never a word from you." He raised a forefinger, and his patient look was replaced by one of sorrowing gravity. "Don't you realize we might have been killed back there? You really ought to have told me." Chapter 50. There didn't seem much point in a millionaire filling up football pools coupons, but it was one of the motive forces in old Harold Denham's life. It made a tremendous bond between us, because despite his devotion to the pools, Harold knew nothing about football, had never seen a match, and was unable to name a single player in league football. And when he found that I could discourse knowledgeably not only about Everton and Preston North End, but even about Arbroath and Cowdenbeath, the respect with which he had always treated me deepened into a wide-eyed deference. Of course, we had first met over his animals. He had an assortment of dogs, cats, rabbits, budgies, and goldfish, which made me a frequent visitor to the dusty mansion, whose Victorian turrets peeping above their sheltered woods could be seen for miles around Darrowby. When I first knew him, the circumstances of my visits were entirely normal. His fox terrier had cut its pad, or the old grey tabby was having trouble with her sinusitis. But later on, I began to wonder. He called me out so often on a Wednesday, and the excuse was, at times, so trivial, that I began seriously to suspect that there was nothing wrong with the animals, but that Harold was in difficulties with his 9 results, or the Easy 6. I can never be quite sure, but it was funny how he always received me with the same words. "Ah, Mr. Herriot, how are your pools?" He used to say the word in a long, drawn, loving way. Pools. This inquiry had been unvarying ever since I had won 16 shillings one week on the 3 draws. I can never forget the awe with which he fingered the little slip from Littlewoods, looking unbelievingly from it to the postal order. This was the only time I was a winner, but it made no difference. I was still the oracle Unchallenged, supreme. Harold never won anything, ever. The Denhams were a family of note in North Yorkshire. The immensely wealthy industrialists of the last century had become leaders in the world of agriculture. They were gentlemen farmers who used their money to build up pedigree herds of dairy cows or pigs. They ploughed out the high stony moorland and fertilized it and made it grow crops. They drained sour bogs and made them yield potatoes and turnips. They were the chairmen of committees, masters of foxhounds, leaders of the county society. But Harold had opted out of all that at an early age. He had refuted the age-old dictum that you can't be happy doing absolutely nothing. All day and every day he pottered around his house and his few untidy acres, uninterested in the world outside, not entirely aware of what was going on in his immediate vicinity, but utterly content. I don't think he ever gave a thought to other people's opinions, which was just as well because they were often unkind. His brother, the eminent Basil Denham, referred to him invariably as "that bloody fool," and with the country people it was often "nobbut ninepence in shilling." Personally, I'd always found something appealing in him. He was kind, friendly, with a sense of fun, and I enjoyed going to his house. He and his wife ate all their meals in the kitchen, and in fact seemed to spend most of their time there, so I usually went round to the back of the house. On this particular day, it was to see his Great Dane bitch, which had just had pups and seemed unwell. Since it wasn't Wednesday, I felt there really might be something amiss, and I hurried round. Harold gave me his usual greeting. He had the most attractive voice, round, fruity, mellow, like a bishop's, and for the 100th time I thought how odd it was to hear these organ-like vocal cords intoning such incongruities as Mansfield Town or Bradford City. "I wonder if you could advise me, Mr. Herriot," he said as we left the kitchen and entered a long, ill-lit passage. "I'm searching for an away winner, and I wondered about Sunderland at Aston Villa." I stopped and fell into an attitude of deep thought while Harold regarded me anxiously. "Well, I'm not sure, Mr. Denham," I replied. "Sunderland are a good side, but I happen to know that Rake Carter's auntie isn't too well at present, and it could easily affect his game this Saturday." Harold looked crestfallen, and he nodded his head gravely a few times. Then he looked closely at me for a few seconds and broke into a shout of laughter. "Mr. Herriot, you're pulling my leg again." He seized my arm, gave it a squeeze, and shuffled off along the passage, chuckling deeply. We traversed a labyrinth of gloomy, cobwebbed passages before he led the way into a little gun-room. My patient was lying on a raised wooden dog bed, and I recognized her as the enormous Dane I had seen leaping around at previous visits. I had never treated her, but my first sight of her had dealt a blow at one of my newfound theories, that you didn't find big dogs in big houses. Times without number, I had critically observed bull-mastiffs, Alsatians, and Old English sheepdogs catapulting out of the tiny backstreet dwellings of Dannaby, pulling their helpless owners on the end of a lead, while in the spacious rooms and wide acres of the stately homes I saw nothing but border terriers and Jack Russells. But Harold would have to be different. He patted the bitch's head. "She had the puppies yesterday and she's got a nasty dark discharge. She's eating well, but I'd like you to look her over." Great Danes, like most of the big breeds, are usually placid animals, and the bitch didn't move as I took her temperature. She lay on her side, listening contentedly to the squeals of her family as the little blind creatures climbed over each other to get at the engorged teats. "Yes, she's got a slight fever, and you're right about the discharge." I gently palpated the long hollow of the flank. "I don't think there's another pup there, but I'd better have a feel inside just to make sure. Could you bring me some warm water soap and a towel, please?" As the door closed behind Harold, I looked idly around the gun-room. It wasn't much bigger than a cupboard, and since another of Harold's idiosyncrasies was that he never killed anything, was devoid of guns. The glass cases contained only musty-bound volumes of Blackwood's Magazine and Country Life. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, wondering why the old chap was taking so long. Then I turned to look at an old print on the wall. It was the usual hunting scene, and I was peering through the grimy glass and wondering why they always drew those horses flying over the stream with such impossible long legs, when I heard a sound behind me. It was a faint growl, a deep rumble, soft but menacing. I turned and saw the bitch rising very slowly from her bed. She wasn't getting to her feet in the normal way of dogs. It was as though she were being lifted up by strings somewhere in the ceiling, the legs straightening almost imperceptibly, the body rigid, every hair bristling. All the time she glared at me unblinkingly, and for the first time in my life I realized the meaning of blazing eyes. I had only once seen anything like this before, and it was on the cover of an old copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles. At the time I had thought the artist ridiculously fanciful. But here were two eyes filled with the same yellow fire, and fixed unwaveringly on mine. She thought I was after her pups, of course. After all, her master had gone, and there was only this stranger standing motionless and silent in the corner of the room, obviously up to no good. One thing was sure. She was going to come at me any second, and I blessed the luck that had made me stand right by the door. Carefully, I inched my left hand towards the handle as the bitch still rose with terrifying slowness, still rumbling deep in her chest. I had almost reached the handle when I made the mistake of making a quick grab for it. Just as I touched the metal, the bitch came out of the bed like a rocket and sank her teeth into my wrist. I thumped her over the head with my right fist, and she let go and seized me high on the inside of the left thigh. This really made me yell out, and I don't know just what my immediate future would have been if I hadn't bumped up against the only chair in the room. It was old and flimsy, but it saved me. As the bitch, apparently tiring of gnawing my leg, made a sudden leap at my face, I snatched the chair up and fended her off. The rest of my spell in the gunroom was a sort of parody of a lion-taming act, and would have been richly funny to an impartial observer. In fact, in later years I have often wished I could have had a cine-film of the episode. But at the time, with that great animal stalking me round those few cramped yards of space, the blood trickling down my leg, and only a rickety chair to protect me, I didn't feel a bit like laughing. There was a dreadful dedication in the way she followed me, and those maddened eyes never left my face for an instant. The pups, furious at the unceremonious removal of their delightful source of warmth and nourishment, were crawling blindly across the bed and bawling, all 9 of them at the top of their voices. The din acted as a spur to the bitch, and the louder it became, the more she pressed home her attack. Every few seconds she would launch herself at me, and I would prance about stabbing at her with my chair in best circus fashion. Once she bore me back against the wall, chair and all. On her hind legs she was about as tall as me, and I had a disturbing close-up of the snarling, gaping jaws. My biggest worry was that my chair was beginning to show signs of wear. The bitch had already crunched 2 of the spars effortlessly away, and I tried not to think of what would happen if the whole thing finally disintegrated. But I was working my way back to the door, and when I felt the handle at my back, I knew I had to do something about it. I gave a final, intimidating shout, threw the remains of the chair at the bitch, and dived out into the corridor. As I slammed the door behind me and leant against it, I could feel the panels quivering as the big animal threw herself against the wood. I was sitting on the floor with my back against the passage wall, pants round my ankles, examining my wounds, when I saw Harold pass across the far end, pottering vaguely along with a basin of steaming water held in front of him and a towel over his shoulder. I could understand now why he had been so long. He had been wandering around like that all the time. Being Harold, it was just possible that he had got lost in his own house. Or maybe he was just worrying about his 4 aways. Back at Scaledale House I had to endure some unkind remarks about my straddling gait, but later in my bedroom the smile left Siegfried's face as he examined my leg. "Right up there, by God!" He gave a low, awed whistle. "You know, James, we've often made jokes about what a savage dog might do to us one day. Well, I tell you, boy, it damn nearly happened to you." Chapter 51. This was my second winter in Danbury, so I didn't feel the same sense of shock when it started to be really rough in November. When they were getting a drizzle of rain down there on the plain, the high country was covered in a few hours by a white blanket, which filled in the roads, smoothed out familiar landmarks, transformed our world into something strange and new. This was what they meant on the radio when they talked about snow on high ground. When the snow started in earnest, it had a strangling effect on the whole district. Traffic crawled laboriously between the mounds thrown up by the snowploughs. Herne Fell hung over Dannaby like a great gleaming whale, and in the town the people dug deep paths to their garden gates and cleared the drifts from their front doors. They did it without fuss, with the calm of long use, and in the knowledge that they would probably have to do it again tomorrow. Every new fall struck a fresh blow at the vets. We managed to get to most of our cases, but we lost a lot of sweat in the process. Sometimes we were lucky, and were able to bump along in the wake of a council plough, but more often we drove as far as we could and walked the rest of the way. On the morning when Mr. Clayton of Pike House rang up, we'd had a night of continuous snow. "Young beast with a touch of cold," he said. "Will you come?" To get to his place, you had to cross over Pike Edge, and then drop down into a little valley. It was a lovely drive in the summer, but I wondered. "What's the road like?" I asked. "Road? Road?" Mr. Clayton's reaction was typically airy. Farmers in the less accessible places always brushed aside such queries. "Road's right enough. Just take a bit of care, and you'll get here without any trouble." Siegfried wasn't so sure. "Well, you'll certainly have to walk over the top, and it's doubtful whether the ploughs will have cleared the lower road. It's up to you." "Oh, I'll have a go. There's not much doing this morning, and I feel like a bit of exercise." In the yard, I found that old Boardman had done a tremendous job in his quiet way. He had dug open the big double doors and cleared a way for the cars to get out. I put what I thought I would need into a small rucksack. Some expectorant mixture, a tub of electuary, a syringe, and a few ampoules of pneumonia serum. Then I threw the most important item of my winter equipment, a broad-bladed shovel, into the back, and left. The bigger roads had already been cleared by the council ploughs which had been clanking past Skeldale House since before dawn, but the surface was rough, and I had a slow, bumpy ride. It was more than 10 miles to the Clayton farm, and it was one of those iron days when the frost piled thickly on the windscreen, blotting out everything within minutes. But this morning I was triumphant. I had just bought a wonderful new invention, a couple of strands of wire mounted on a strip of Bakelite and fastened to the windscreen with rubber suckers. It worked from the car batteries and cleared a small space of vision. No more did I have to climb out wearily and scrub and scratch at the frozen glass every half-mile or so. I sat, peering delightedly through a flawlessly clear semicircle about 8 inches wide, at the countryside unwinding before me like a film show. The grey stone villages, silent and withdrawn under their smothering white cloak, the low, burdened branches of the roadside trees. I was enjoying it so much that I hardly noticed the ache in my toes. Freezing feet were the rule in those days, before car heaters, especially when you could see the road flashing past through the holes in the floorboards. On long journeys, I really began to suffer towards the end. It was like that today when I got out of the car at the foot of the Pike Edge Road. My fingers, too, throbbed painfully as I stamped around and swung my arms. The ploughs hadn't even attempted to clear the little side road, which wound its way upwards and into the valley beyond. Its solid, creamy, wall-to-wall filling said, "No, you can't come up here," with that detached finality I'd come to know so well. But as always, even in my disappointment, I looked with wonder at the shapes the wind had sculpted in the night. Flowing folds of the most perfect smoothness tapering to the finest of points, deep hollows with knife-edge rims, soaring cliffs with overhanging margins almost transparent in their delicacy. Hitching the rucksack on my shoulder, I felt a kind of subdued elation. With a leather golf jacket buttoned up to my neck and an extra pair of thick socks under my Wellingtons, I was ready for anything. No doubt I considered there was something just a bit dashing and gallant in the picture of the dedicated young vet with his magic potions on his back, battling against the odds to succour a helpless animal. I stood for a moment gazing at the fell, curving clean and cold into the sullen sky. An expectant hush lay on the fields, the frozen river, and the still trees as I started off. I kept up a good pace. First over a bridge with the river white and silent beneath, then up and up, picking my way over the drifts till the road twisted almost invisible under some low cliffs. Despite the cold, the sweat was beginning to prick on my back when I got to the top. I looked around me. I had been up here several times in June and July, and I could remember the sunshine, the smell of the warm grass, and the scent of flowers and pines that came up the hill from the valley below. But it was hard to relate the smiling landscape of last summer with this desolation. The flat moorland on the fell top was a white immensity, rolling away to the horizon, with the sky pressing down like a dark blanket. I could see the farm down there in its hollow, and it too looked different. Small, remote, like a charcoal drawing against the hills bulking smooth and white beyond. A pine wood made a dark smudge on the slopes, but the scene had been wiped clean of most of its familiar features. I could see the road only in places. The walls were covered over most of their length, but the farm was visible all the way. I had gone about half a mile towards it when a sudden gust of wind blew up the surface snow into a cloud of fine particles. Just for a few seconds, I found myself completely alone. The farm, the surrounding moor, everything disappeared, and I had an eerie sense of isolation till the veil cleared. It was hard going in the deep snow, and in the drifts I sank over the tops of my Wellingtons. I kept at it, head down, to within a few hundred yards of the stone building. I was just thinking that it had all been pretty easy, really, when I looked up and saw a waving curtain of 1,000,000 black dots bearing down on me. I quickened my steps, and just before the blizzard hit me, I marked the position of the farm. But after 10 minutes stumbling and slithering, I realized I had missed the place. I was heading for a shape that didn't exist. It was etched only in my mind. I stood for a few moments, feeling again the chilling sense of isolation. I was convinced I had gone too far to the left, and after a few gasping breaths, struck off to the right. It wasn't long before I knew I had gone in the wrong direction again. I began to fall into deep holes up to the armpits in the snow, reminding me that the ground was not really flat on these high moors, but pitted by countless peat hags. As I struggled on, I told myself that the whole thing was ridiculous. I couldn't be far from the warm fireside at Pike House. This wasn't the North Pole. But my mind went back to the great empty stretch of moor beyond the farm, and I had to stifle a feeling of panic. The numbing cold seemed to erase all sense of time. Soon I had no idea how long I'd been falling into the holes and crawling out. I did know that each time it was getting harder work dragging myself out, and it was becoming more and more tempting to sit down and rest, even sleep. There was something hypnotic in the way the big soft flakes brushed noiselessly across my skin and mounted thickly on my closed eyes. I was trying to shut out the conviction that if I fell down many more times I wouldn't get up, when a dark shape hovered suddenly ahead. Then my outflung arms touched something hard and rough. Unbelievingly, I felt my way over the stone square blocks till I came to a corner. Beyond that was a square of light. It was the kitchen window of the farm. Thumping on the door, I leant against the smooth timbers, mouth gaping, chest heaving agonizingly. My immense relief must have bordered on hysteria, because it seemed to me that when the door was opened, the right thing would be to fall headlong into the room. My mind played with the picture of the family crowding round the prostrate figure, plying him with brandy. When the door did open, however, something kept me on my feet. Mr. Clayton stood there for a few seconds, apparently unmoved by the sight of the distraught snowman in front of him. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Herriot. You couldn't have come better. I've just finished me dinner. Hang on a minute, and I'll get me hat. Beast's just across the yard." He reached behind the door, stuck a battered trilby on his head, put his hands in his pockets, and sauntered over the cobbles, whistling. He knocked up the latch of the calf house, and with a profound sense of release I stepped inside, away from the relentless cold, the sucking, swirling snow, into an animal warmth and the scent of hay. As I rid myself of my rucksack, 4 long-haired little bullocks regarded me calmly from over a hurdle, their jaws moving rhythmically. They appeared as unconcerned at my appearance as their owner. They showed a mild interest, nothing more. Behind their shaggy heads I could see a fifth small beast with a sack tied round it, and a purulent discharge coming from its nose. It reminded me of the reason for my visit. As my numb fingers fumbled in the pocket for my thermometer, a great gust of wind buffeted the door, setting the latch clicking softly and sending a faint powdering of snow into the dark interior. Mr. Clayton turned and rubbed the pane of the single small window with his sleeve. Picking his teeth with his thumbnail, he peered out at the howling blizzard. "Aye," he said, and belched pleasurably. "It's a plain sort of day." Chapter 52. As I waited for Siegfried to give me my morning list, I pulled my scarf higher till it almost covered my eyes, turned up the collar of my overcoat, and buttoned it tightly under my chin. Then I drew on a pair of holed woolen gloves. A biting north wind was driving the snow savagely past the window, almost parallel with the ground, obliterating the street and everything else with big, swirling flakes. Siegfried bent over the daybook. "Now, let's see what we've got. Barnet, Gill, Sunter, Dent, Cartwright." He began to scribble on a pad. "Oh, and I better see Scrutton's calf. You've been attending to it, I know, but I'm going right past the door. Can you tell me about it?" "Well, yes, it's been breathing a bit fast and running a temperature around 103. I don't think there's any pneumonia there. In fact, I rather suspect it may be developing diphtheria. It has a bit of swelling on the jaw and the throat glands are up." All the time I was speaking, Siegfried continued to write on the pad and only stopped once to whisper to Mrs. Harbottle. Then he looked up brightly. "Pneumonia, eh? How have you been treating it?" "No," I said, "I didn't think it was pneumonia. I've been injecting Prontosil, and I left some liniment to rub to the throat region." But Siegfried was writing hard again. He said nothing till he had made out 2 lists. He tore one from the pad and gave it to me. "Right, you've been applying liniment to the chest. Suppose it might do a bit of good. Which liniment exactly?" "Lin-methyl sal, but they're rubbing it on the calf's throat, not the chest." But Siegfried had turned away to tell Mrs. Harbottle the order of his visits, and I found myself talking to the back of his head. Finally he straightened up and came away from the desk. "Well, that's fine. You have your list. Let's get on." But halfway across the floor he hesitated in his stride and turned back. "Why the devil are you rubbing that liniment on the calf's throat?" "Well, I thought it might relieve the inflammation a bit." "But James, why should there be any inflammation there? Don't you think the liniment would do more good on the chest wall?" Siegfried was wearing his patient look again. "No, I don't. Not in a case of calf diphtheria." Siegfried put his head on one side and a smile of saintly sweetness crept over his face. He laid his hand on my shoulder. "My dear old James, perhaps it would be a good idea if you started right at the beginning. Take all the time you want, there's no hurry. Speak slowly and calmly, and then you won't become confused. You told me you were treating a calf with pneumonia. Now, take it from there." I thrust my hands deep into my coat pockets and began to churn among the thermometers and scissors and little bottles which always dwelt there. "Look, I told you right at the start that I didn't think there was any pneumonia, but that I suspected early diphtheria. There was also a bit of fever, 103. Siegfried was looking past me at the window. "God, just look at that snow. We're going to have some fun getting round today." He dragged his eyes back to my face. "Don't you think that with a temperature of 103 you should be injecting some Prontosil?" He raised his arms sideways and let them fall. "Just a suggestion, James. I wouldn't interfere for the world, but I honestly think that the situation calls for a little Prontosil." "But hell, Siegfried, I am using it!" I shouted. "I told you that way back, but you weren't listening. I've been doing my damnedest to get this across to you, but what chance have I got?" Come, dear boy, come. There's no need to upset yourself." Siegfried's face was transfigured by an internal radiance. Sweetness and charity, forgiveness, tolerance and affection flowed from him in an enveloping wave. I battled with an impulse to kick him swiftly on the shin. James. The voice was caressing. "I've not the slightest doubt you tried in your own way to tell me about this case, but we haven't all got the gift of communication. You are the most excellent fellow, but must apply yourself to this. It is simply a matter of marshalling your facts and presenting them in an orderly manner. Then you wouldn't get confused and mixed up as you've done this morning. It's only a question of practice, I'm sure." He gave an encouraging wave of his hand and was gone. I strode quickly through to the stockroom and, seeing a big, empty cardboard box on the floor, dealt it a vicious kick. I put so much venom into it that my foot went clear through the cardboard, and I was trying to free myself when Tristan came in. He had been stoking the fire and had witnessed the conversation. He watched silently as I plunged about the room, swearing and trying to shake the box loose. "What's up, Jim? Has my big brother been getting under your skin?" I got rid of the box at last and sank down on one of the lower shelves. I don't know. Why should he be getting under my skin now? I've known him quite a long time, and he's always been the same. He's never been any different, but it hasn't bothered me before, not like this anyway. Any other time I'd laugh this sort of thing off. God, what the hell's wrong with me? Tristan put down his coal bucket and looked at me thoughtfully. "There's nothing much wrong with you, Jim. But I can tell you one thing. You've been just a bit edgy since you went out with that Alderson woman." "Oh, God," I groaned and closed my eyes. "Don't remind me." Anyway, I've not seen or heard from her since, so that's the end of that, and I can't blame her. Tristan pulled out his woodbines and squatted down by the coal bucket. "Yes, that's all very well, but look at you. You're suffering, and there's no need for it. All right, you had a disastrous night and she's given you the old heave-ho. Well, so what? Do you know how many times I've been spurned?" "Spurned? I never even got started." "Very well then, but you're still going around like a bullock with a bellyache." "Forget it, lad, and get out into the big world. The rich tapestry of life is waiting for you out there. I've been watching you, working all hours, and when you're not working, you're reading up your cases in the textbooks. And I tell you, this dedicated vet thing is all right up to a point. But you've got to live a little. Think of all the lovely little lasses in Darrowby. You can hardly move for them. And every one just waiting for a big, handsome chap like you to gallop up on his white horse. Don't disappoint them." He leant over and slapped my knee. "Tell you what. Why don't you let me fix something up? A nice little foursome, just what you need." "Oh, I don't know. I'm not keen, really." "Nonsense," Tristan said. "I don't know why I haven't thought of it before. This monkish existence is bad for you. Leave all the details to me." I decided to have an early night and was awakened around 11 o'clock by a heavy weight crashing down on the bed. The room was dark, but I seemed to be enveloped in beer-scented smoke. I coughed and sat up. "Is that you, Tris?" "It is indeed," said the shadowy figure on the end of the bed. "And I bring you glad tidings. You remember Brenda? That little nurse I've seen you around with? The very same. Well, she's got a pal, Connie, who's even more beautiful. The four of us are going dancing at the Poulton Institute on Tuesday night." The voice was thick with beery triumph. "What, you mean me too?" "By God, I do, and you're going to have the best time you've ever had, I'll see to that." He blew a last, choking blast of smoke into my face and left, chuckling. Chapter 53. "We're having an hot dinner and entertainers." My reaction to the word surprised me. They stirred up a mixture of emotions, all of them pleasant. Fulfillment, happy acceptance, almost triumph. I know by now that there's not the slightest chance of anybody asking me to be president of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. But if they had, I wonder if I'd been more pleased than when I heard about the hot dinner. The reason, I suppose, was that the words reflected the attitude of a typical Dales farmer towards myself. And this was important. Because though, after just over a year, I was becoming accepted as a vet, I was always conscious of the gulf that was bound to exist between these hill folk and a city product like me. Much as I admired them, I was aware always that we were different. It was inevitable, I knew, but it still rankled, so that a sincere expression of friendship from one of them struck a deep answering chord in me. Especially when it came from somebody like Dick Rudd. I had first met Dick last winter on the doorstep of Scaledale House, at 6 o'clock on the kind of black morning when country vets wonder about their choice of profession. Shivering as the ever-present passage draft struck at my pajamaed legs, I switched on the light and opened the door. I saw a small figure muffled up in an old army greatcoat and balaclava leaning on a bicycle. Behind him, the light spilled onto a few feet of streaming pavement where the rain beat down in savage swathes. "Sorry to ring your bell at this hour, Governor," he said. "Me name's Rudd, Birch Tree Farm, Culston. I've got a heifer calving and she's not getting on with job. Will you come?" I looked closer at the thin face, at the water trickling down the cheeks and dripping from the end of his nose. "Right, I'll get dressed and come straight along. But why don't you leave your bike here and come with me in the car? Coulston's about 4 miles, isn't it? You must be soaked through." Nay, it'll be all right." The face broke into the most cheerful of grins, and under the sopping balaclava a pair of lively blue eyes glinted at me. "I'd only have to come back and get it another time. I'll get off now, and you won't be there long before me." He mounted the bike quickly and pedalled away. People who think farming is a pleasant, easy life should have been there to see the hunched figure disappear into the blackness and the driving rain. No car, no telephone, a night up with the heifer, 8 miles biking in the rain, and a back-breaking day ahead of him. Whenever I thought of the existence of the small farmer, it made my own occasional bursts of activity seem small stuff indeed. I produced a nice live heifer calf for Dick that first morning, and later, gratefully drinking a cup of hot tea in the farmhouse kitchen, I was surprised at the throng of young Rudds milling around me. There were 7 of them, and they were unexpectedly grown up. Their ages ranged from 20-odd down to about 10, and I hadn't thought of Dick as middle-aged. In the dim light of the doorway at Scaledale House, and later in the bar, lit only by a smoke-blackened oil lamp, his lively movements and perky manner had seemed those of a man in his 30s. But as I looked at him now, I could see that the short, wiry hair was streaked with grey, and a maze of fine wrinkles spread from around his eyes into his cheeks. In their early married life, the Rudds, anxious like all farmers for male children, had observed with increasing chagrin the arrival of 5 successive daughters. "We nearly packed up then," Dick confided to me once. But they didn't, and their perseverance was rewarded at last by the appearance of 2 fine boys. A farmer farms for his sons, and Dick had something to work for now. As I came to know them better, I used to observe the family with wonder. The 5 girls were all tall, big-limbed, handsome, and already the 2 chunky young boys gave promise of massive growth. I kept looking from them to their frail little parents. "Not a picking on either of us," as Mrs. Rudd used to say, and wonder how the miracle had happened. It puzzled me, too, how Mrs. Rudd, armed only with the milk cheque from Dick's few shaggy cows, had managed to feed them all, never mind bring them to this state of physical perfection. I gained my first clue one day when I'd been seeing some calves, and I was asked to have a bit of dinner with them. Butcher's meat was a scarce commodity on the hill farms, and I was familiar with the usual expedients for filling up the eager stomachs before the main course, the doughy slabs of Yorkshire pudding or the heap of suet dumplings. But Mrs. Rudd had her own method. A big bowl of rice pudding with lots of milk was her hors d'oeuvre. It was a new one on me, and I could see the family slowing down as they ploughed their way through. I was ravenous when I sat down, but after the rice, I viewed the rest of the meal with total detachment. Dick believed in veterinary advice for everything, so I was a frequent visitor to Birch Tree Farm. After every visit, there was an unvarying ritual. I was asked into the house for a cup of tea, and the whole family downed tools and sat down to watch me drink it. On weekdays, the eldest girl was out at work and the boys were at school, but on Sundays, the ceremony reached its full splendour with myself sipping the tea and all 9 Rudds sitting around in what I can only call an admiring circle. My every remark was greeted with nods and smiles all round. There is no doubt that it was good for my ego to have an entire family literally hanging on my words, but at the same time, it made me feel curiously humble. I suppose it was because of Dick's character. Not that he was unique in any way, there were thousands of small farmers just like him, but he seemed to embody the best qualities of the dalesman. The indestructibility, the tough philosophy, the unthinking generosity and hospitality. And there were the things that were Dick's own. The integrity, which could be read always in his steady eyes, and the humour which was never far away. Dick was no wit, but he was always trying to say ordinary things in a funny way. If I asked him to get hold of a cow's nose for me, he would say, solemnly, "I'll endeavour to do so." Or I remember when I was trying to lift a square of plywood which was penning a calf in a corner, he said, "Just a minute till I raise portcullis." When he broke into a smile, a kind of radiance flooded his pinched features. When I held my audiences in the kitchen with all the family reflecting Dick's outlook in their eager laughter, I marvelled at their utter contentment with their lot. None of them had known ease or softness, but it didn't matter, and they looked on me as a friend, and I was proud. Whenever I left the farm, I found something on the seat of my car. A couple of homemade scones, 3 eggs. I don't know how Mrs. Rudd spared them, but she never failed. Dick had a burning ambition: to upgrade his stock until he had a dairy herd which would live up to his ideals. Without money behind him, he knew it would be a painfully slow business, but he was determined. It probably wouldn't be in his own lifetime, but sometime, perhaps when his sons were grown up, people would come and look with admiration at the cows of Birch Tree. I was there to see the very beginning of it. When Dick stopped me on the road one morning and asked me to come up to his place with him, I knew by his air of suppressed excitement that something big had happened. He led me into the bar and stood silent. He didn't need to say anything, because I was staring unbelievingly at a bovine aristocrat. Dick's cows had been scratched together over the years, and they were a motley lot. Many of them were old animals discarded by more prosperous farmers because of their pendulous udders or because they were 3 tittyduns. Others had been reared by Dick from calves and tended to be rough-haired and scruffy. But halfway down the byre, contrasting almost violently with her neighbours, was what seemed to me a perfect dairy shorthorn cow. In these days, when the Frisian has surged over England in a black and white flood, and inundated even the dales, which were the very home of the shorthorn, such cows as I looked at that day at Dick Rudd's are no longer to be seen. But she represented all the glory and the pride of her breed. The wide pelvis tapering to fine shoulders, and a delicate head. The level udder thrusting back between the hind legs, and the glorious colour, dark roan. That was what they used to call a good colour. And whenever I delivered a dark roan calf, the farmer would say, "It's a good colour, dun," and it would be more valuable accordingly. The geneticists are perfectly right, of course. The dark-roaned cows gave no more milk than the reds or the whites, but we loved them, and they were beautiful. "Where did she come from, Dick?" I said, still staring. Dick's voice was elaborately casual. "Oh, I went over to Weldon's of Cranby and picked her out. Do you like her?" "She's a picture. A show cow. I've never seen one better." Weldons were the biggest pedigree breeders in the Northern Dales, and I didn't ask whether Dick had cajoled his bank manager or had been saving up for years just for this. "Aye, she's a 7-galloner when she gets going. And top butterfat, too. Reckon she'll be as good as 2 of my other cows. And a calf out of her'll be worth a bit." He stepped forward and ran his hand along the perfectly level, smoothly fleshed back. "She's got a great fancy pedigree name, but Mrs. has called her Strawberry." I knew as I stood there in the primitive cobbled bar with its wooden partitions and rough stone walls that I was looking not just at a cow, but at the foundation of the new herd. at Dick Rudd's hopes for the future. It was about a month later when he phoned me. "I want you to come and look at Strawberry for me," he said. "She's been doing grand, tippling the milk out, but there's somewhat amiss with her this morning." The cow didn't really look ill, and in fact she was eating when I examined her. But I noticed that she gulped slightly when she swallowed. Her temperature was normal and her lungs clear, but when I stood by her head I could just hear a faint snoring sound. "It's her throat, Dick," I said. "It may be just a bit of inflammation, but there's a chance that she's starting a little abscess in there." I spoke lightly, but I wasn't happy. Post-pharyngeal abscesses were, in my limited experience, nasty things. They were situated in an inaccessible place, right away behind the back of the throat, and if they got very large, could interfere seriously with the breathing. I had been lucky with the few I had seen. They had either been small and regressed or had ruptured spontaneously. I gave an injection of Prontosil and turned to Dick. "I want you to foment this area behind the angle of the jaw with hot water and rub this salve well in afterwards. You may manage to burst it that way. Do it at least 3 times a day." I kept looking at her over the next 10 days, and the picture was one of steady development of the abscess. The cow was still not acutely ill, but she was eating a lot less. She was thinner, and she was going off her milk. Most of the time I felt rather helpless, as I knew that only the rupture of the abscess would bring relief, and the various injections I was giving her were largely irrelevant. But the infernal thing was taking a long time to burst. It happened that just then Siegfried went off on an equine conference which was to last a week. For a few days I was at full stretch, and hardly had time to think about Dick's cow until he biked in to see me one morning. He was cheerful as usual, but he had a strained look. "Will you come and see Strawberry? She's gone right down to Nick over the last 3 days. I don't like the look of her." I dashed straight out and was in the bar at Birch Tree before Dick was halfway home. The sight of Strawberry stopped me in mid-stride, and I stared dry-mouthed at what had once been a show cow. The flesh had melted from her incredibly, and she was little more than a hide-covered skeleton. Her rasping breathing could be heard all over the byre, and she exhaled with a curious outpuffing of the cheeks which I had never seen before. Her terrified eyes were fixed rigidly on the wall in front of her. Occasionally she gave a painful little cough which brought saliva drooling from her mouth. I must have stood there for a long time because I became aware of Dick at my shoulder. "She's the worst screw in the place now," he said grimly. I winced inwardly. "Hell, Dick, I'm sorry. I had no idea she'd got in this state. I can't believe it." "Aye, well, it's all happened sudden-like. I've never seen a cow alter so fast." "The abscess must be right at its peak," I said. "She hasn't much space to breathe through now, you see." As I spoke, the cow's limbs began to tremble, and for a moment I thought she would fall. I ran out to the car and got a tin of kaolin poultice. "Come on, let's get this on her throat. It might just do the trick." When we had finished, I looked at Dick. "I think tonight will do it. It's just got to burst. And if it doesn't, she'll snuff it tomorrow," he grunted. I must have looked very woebegone because suddenly his undefeated grin flashed out. "Never mind, lad. You've done everything anybody could do." But as I walked away, I wasn't so sure. Mrs. Rudd met me at the car. It was her baking day, and she pushed a little loaf into my hand. It made me feel worse. Chapter 54. That night I sat alone in the big room at Skeldale House and brooded. Siegfried was still away. I had nobody to turn to, and I wished to God I knew what I was going to do with that cow of Dick's in the morning. By the time I went to bed, I had decided that if nothing further had happened, I would have to go in behind the angle of the jaw with a knife. I knew just where the abscess was, but it was a long way in, and en route there were such horrific things as the carotid artery and the jugular vein. I tried hard to keep them out of my mind, but they haunted my dreams. Huge, throbbing, pulsating things with their precious contents threatening to burst at any moment through their fragile walls. I was awake by 6 o'clock, and after an hour of staring miserably at the ceiling, I could stand it no longer. I got up and without washing or shaving, drove out to the farm. As I crept fearfully into the byre, I saw with sick dismay that Strawberry's stall was empty. So that was that. She was dead. After all, she had looked like it yesterday. I was turning away when Dick called me from the doorway. "I've got her in a box on t'other side of the yard. Thought she'd be more comfortable in there." I almost ran across the cobbles, and as we approached the door, the sound of the dreadful breathing came out to us. Strawberry was off her legs now. It had cost her the last of her strength to walk to the box, and she lay on her chest, her head extended straight in front of her, nostrils dilated, eyes staring, cheeks puffing in her desperate fight for breath. But she was alive, and the surge of relief I felt seemed to prick me into action, blow away my hesitations. "Dick," I said, "I've just got to operate on your cow. This thing is never going to burst in time, so it's now or never. But there is one thing I want you to know. The only way I can think of doing it is to go in from behind the jaw. Now, I've never done this before. I've never seen it done before, and I've never heard of anybody doing it. If I nick any of those big blood vessels in there, it'll kill her within a minute." "She can't last much longer like this," Dick grunted. "There's naught to lose. Get on with it." In most operations in large bovines, we have to pull the animal down with ropes and then use general anesthesia. But there was no need for this with Strawberry. She was too far gone. I just pushed gently at her shoulder, and she rolled onto her side and lay still. I quickly infiltrated the area from beneath the ear to the angle of the jaw with local anesthetic, then laid out my instruments. "Stretch her head straight out and slightly back, Dick," I said. Kneeling in the straw, I incised the skin. Cut carefully through the long, thin layer of the brachiocephalic muscle, and held the fibers apart with retractors. Somewhere down there was my objective, and I tried to picture the anatomy of the region clearly in my mind. Just there, the maxillary veins ran together to form the great jugular, and deeper and more dangerous was the branching, ramifying carotid. If I pushed my knife straight in there, behind the mandibular salivary gland, it had just about hit the spot. But as I held the razor-sharp blade over the small space I had cleared, my hand began to tremble. I tried to steady it, but I was like a man with malaria. The fact had to be faced, that I was too scared to cut any further. I put the scalpel down, lifted a pair of long artery forceps, and pushed them steadily down through the hole in the muscle. It seemed that I had gone an incredibly long way when, almost unbelievingly, I saw a thin trickle of pus along the gleaming metal. I was into the abscess. Gingerly, I opened the forceps as wide as possible to enlarge the drainage hole, and as I did, the trickle became a creamy torrent, which gushed over my hand, down the cow's neck, and onto the straw. I stayed quite still till it had stopped, then withdrew the forceps. Dick looked at me from the other side of the head. "Now what, boss?" he said softly. "Well, I've emptied the thing, Dick," I said, "and by all the laws, she should soon be a lot better. Come on, let's roll her onto her chest again." When we had got the cow settled comfortably with a bale of straw supporting her shoulders, I looked almost entreatingly at her. Surely she would show some sign of improvement. She must feel some relief from that massive evacuation. But Strawberry looked just the same. The breathing, if anything, was worse. I dropped the soiled instruments into a bucket of hot water and antiseptic and began to wash them. I know what it is. The walls of the abscess have become indurated, thickened and hardened, you know, because it's been there a long time. We'll have to wait for them to collapse. Next day, as I hurried across the yard, I felt buoyantly confident. Dick was just coming out of the loose box, and I shouted across to him, "Well, how is she this morning?" He hesitated, and my spirits plummeted to zero. I knew what this meant. He was trying to find something good to say. "Well, I reckon she's about same." "But damn it," I shouted. "She should be much better. Oh, let's have a look at her." The cow wasn't just the same. She was worse. And on top of all the other symptoms, she had a horribly sunken eye, the sign usually of approaching death in the bovine. We both stood looking at the grim wreck of the once beautiful cow. Then Dick broke the silence, speaking gently. "Well, what do you think? Is it Malloch for her?" The sound of the knacker man's name added the final note of despair. And indeed, Strawberry looked just like any of the other broken-down animals that man came to collect. I shuffled my feet miserably. "I don't know what to say, Dick. There's nothing more I can do." I took another look at the gasping, staring head, the mass of bubbling foam around the lips and nostrils. "You don't want her to suffer any more, and neither do I, but don't get Malloch yet. She's distressed, but not actually in pain, and I want to give her another day. If she's just the same tomorrow, send her in." The very words sounded futile. Every instinct told me the thing was hopeless. I turned to go, bowed down by a sense of failure heavier than I'd ever known. As I went out into the yard, Dick called after me. "Don't worry, lad. These things happen. Thank you for all you've done." The words were like a whip across my back. If he had cursed me thoroughly, I'd have felt a lot better. What had he to thank me for with his cow lying dying back there? The only good cow he'd ever owned. This disaster would just about floor Dick Rudd, and he was telling me not to worry. When I opened the car door, I saw a cabbage on the seat. Mrs. Rudd, too, was still at it. I leant my elbow on the roof of the car, and the words flowed from me. It was as if the sight of the cabbage had tapped the deep well of my frustration, and I directed a soliloquy at the unheeding vegetable, in which I ranged far over my many inadequacies. I pointed out the injustice of a situation where kindly people like the Rudds, in dire need of skilled veterinary assistance, had called on Mr. Herriot, who had responded by falling flat on his face. I drew attention to the fact that the Rudds, instead of hounding me off the place as I deserved, had thanked me sincerely and started to give me cabbages. I went on for quite a long time, and when I had finally finished, I felt a little better. But not much, because as I drove home, I could not detect a glimmer of hope. If the walls of that abscess had been going to collapse, they would have done so by now. I should have sent her in. She would be dead in the morning anyway. I was so convinced of this that I didn't hurry to Birch Tree next day. I took it in with the round, and it was almost midday when I drove through the gates. I knew what I would find. The usual grim signs of a vet's failure. The box door open and the drag marks where Malloch had winched the carcass across the yard to his lorry. But everything was as usual, and as I walked over to the silent box, I steeled myself. The knacker man hadn't arrived yet, but there was nothing surer than that my patient was lying dead in there. She couldn't possibly have hung on till now. My fingers fumbled at the catch as though something in me didn't want to look inside, but with a final wrench, I threw the door open. Strawberry was standing there, eating hay from the rack, and not just eating it, but jerking it through the bars almost playfully as cows do when they are really enjoying their food. It looked as though she couldn't get it down fast enough, pulling down great fragrant tufts and dragging them into her mouth with her rasp-like tongue. As I stared at her, an organ began to play somewhere in the back of my mind, not just a little organ, but a mighty instrument with gleaming pipes climbing high into the shadows of the cathedral roof. I went into the box, closed the door behind me, and sat down in the straw in a corner. I had waited a long time for this. I was going to enjoy it. The cow was almost a walking skeleton, with her beautiful, dark roan skin stretched tightly over the jutting bones. The once proud udder was a shriveled purse, dangling uselessly above her hocks. As she stood, she trembled from sheer weakness, but there was a light in her eye, a calm intensity in the way she ate, which made me certain that she would soon fight her way back to her old glory. There was just the two of us in the box, and occasionally Strawberry would turn her head towards me and regard me steadily, her jaws moving rhythmically. It seemed like a friendly look to me. In fact, I wouldn't have been surprised if she had winked at me. I don't know just how long I sat in there, but I savoured every minute. It took some time for it to sink in that what I was watching was really happening. The swallowing was effortless. There was no salivation, no noise from her breathing. When I finally went out and closed the door behind me, the cathedral organ was really blasting with all stops out, the exultant peals echoing back from the vaulted roof. The cow made an amazing recovery. I saw her 3 weeks later, and her bones were magically clothed with flesh. Her skin shone, and, most important, the magnificent udder bulged turgid beneath her, a neat little teat proudly erect at each corner. I was pretty pleased with myself, but of course a cold assessment of the case would show only one thing: that I had done hardly anything right from start to finish. At the very beginning I should have been down that cow's throat with a knife, but at that time I just didn't know how. In later years I have opened many a score of these abscesses by going in through a mouth gag with a scalpel tied to my fingers. It was a fairly heroic undertaking, as the cow or bullock didn't enjoy it, and was inclined to throw itself down with me inside it, almost to the shoulder. It was simply asking for a broken arm. When I talk about this to the present-day young vets, they are inclined to look at me blankly, because most of these abscesses undoubtedly had a tuberculous origin, and since attestation they are rarely seen. But I can imagine it might bring a wry smile to the faces of my contemporaries as their memories are stirred. The post-pharyngeal operation had the attraction that recovery was spectacular and rapid, and I've had my own share of these little triumphs, but none of them gave me as much satisfaction as the one I did the wrong way. It was a few weeks after the strawberry episode, and I was back in my old position in the Rudd's kitchen with the family around me. This time I was in no position to drop my usual pearls of wisdom because I was trying to cope with a piece of Mrs. Rudd's apple tart. Mrs. Rudd, I knew, could make delicious apple tarts, but this was a special kind she produced for allowance time, for taking out to Dick and the family when they were working in the fields. I had chewed at the 2-inch pastry till my mouth had dried out. Somewhere inside there was no doubt a sliver of apple, but as yet I had been unable to find it. I didn't dare to try to speak in case I blew out a shower of crumbs, and in the silence which followed I wondered if anybody would help me out. It was Mrs. Rudd who spoke up. "Mr. Herriot," she said in her quiet, matter-of-fact way, "Dick has something to say to you." Dick cleared his throat and sat up straighter in his chair. I turned towards him expectantly, my cheeks still distended by the obdurate mass. He looked unusually serious, and I felt a twinge of apprehension. "What I want to say is this," he said. "It'll soon be our silver wedding anniversary, and we're going to have a bit of a do. We want you to be our guest." I almost choked. "Dick, Mrs. Rudd, that's very kind of you." "I'd love that. I'd be honoured to come." Dick inclined his head gravely. He still looked portentous, as though there was something big to follow. "Good. I think you'll enjoy it because it's going to be a right do. We've got a room booked at King's Head at Carsley." "Gosh, well, that sounds great." "Aye. Mrs. and me have worked it all out." He squared his thin shoulders and lifted his chin proudly. "We're having an hot dinner and entertainers." Chapter 55. As time passed, and I painfully clothed the bare bones of my theoretical knowledge with practical experience, I began to realize there was another side to veterinary practice they didn't mention in the books. It had to do with money. Money has always formed a barrier between the farmer and the vet. I think this is because there is a deeply embedded, maybe subconscious conviction in many farmers' minds that they know more about their stocks than any outsider, and it is an admission of defeat to pay somebody else to doctor them. The wall was bad enough in those early days when they had to pay the medical practitioners for treating their own ailments, and when there was no free agricultural advisory service. But it is worse now, when there is the health service and NAAS, and the veterinary surgeon stands pitilessly exposed as the only man who has to be paid. Most farmers, of course, swallow the pill and get out their checkbooks. But there is a proportion, maybe about 10%, who do their best to opt out of the whole business. We had our own 10% in Darrowby, and it was a small but constant irritation. As an assistant, I was not financially involved, and it didn't seem to bother Siegfried unduly except when the quarterly bills were sent out. Then it really got through to him. Miss Harbottle used to type out the accounts and present them to him in a neat pile, and that was when it started. He would go through them one by one, and it was a harrowing experience to watch his blood pressure gradually rise. I found him crouched over his desk one night. It was about 11 o'clock, and he had had a hard day. His resistance was right down. He was scrutinizing each bill before placing it face down on a pile on his left. On his right, there was a smaller pile, and whenever he placed one there, it was to the accompaniment of a peevish muttering, or occasionally a violent outburst. "Would you believe it?" he grunted as I came in. "Henry Bransom. More than 2 years since we saw a penny of his money, yet he lives like a sultan. Never misses a market for miles around, gets as tight as an owl several nights a week, and I saw him putting £10 on a horse at the races last month." He banged the piece of paper down and went on with his job, breathing deeply. Then he froze over another account. "And look at this one! Old Summers of Low Ness. I bet he's got thousands of pounds hidden under his bed, but by God he won't part with any of it to me." He was silent for a few moments as he transferred several sheets to the main pile. Then he swung round on me with a loud cry, waving a paper in my face. "Oh, no! Oh, Christ, James, this is too much! Bert Mason here owes me 27 and sixpence. I must have spent more than that sending him bills year in, year out, and do you know, I saw him driving past the surgery yesterday in a brand-new car. The bloody scoundrel!" He hurled the bill down and started his scrutiny again. I noticed he was only using one hand while the other churned among his hair. I hoped fervently that he might hit upon a seam of good payers, because I didn't think his nervous system could take much more. And it seems that my hopes were answered, because several minutes went by with only the quiet lifting and laying of the paper sheets. Then Siegfried stiffened suddenly in his chair and sat quite motionless as he stared down at his desk. He lifted an account and held it for several seconds at eye level. I steeled myself. This must be a beauty. But to my surprise, Siegfried began to giggle softly. Then he threw back his head and gave a great bellow of laughter. He laughed until he seemed to have no strength to laugh any more. Then he turned to me. "It's the Major, James," he said weakly. "The dear old gallant Major. You know, you can't help admiring the man. He owed my predecessor a fair bit when I bought the practice, and he still owes it. And I've never had a sou for all the work I've done for him. The thing is, he's the same with everybody, and yet he gets away with it. He's a genuine artist. These other fellows are just fumbling amateurs by comparison." He got up, reached up into the glass-fronted cupboard above the mantelpiece, and pulled out the whiskey bottle and 2 glasses. He carelessly tipped a prodigal measure into each glass and handed one to me. Then he sank back into his chair, still grinning. The Major had magically restored his good humour. Sipping my drink, I reflected that there was no doubt Major Bullivant's character had a rich, compelling quality. He presented an elegant patrician front to the world, beautiful Shakespearean actor voice, impeccable manners, and an abundance of sheer presence. Whenever he unbent sufficiently to throw me a friendly word, I felt honoured, even though I knew I was doing his work for nothing. He had a small, cosy farm, a tweed-clad wife, and several daughters who had ponies and were active helpers for the local hunt. Everything in his entire menage was right and fitting, but he never paid anybody. He had been in the district about 3 years, and on his arrival the local tradesmen, dazzled by his facade, had fallen over each other to win his custom. After all, he appeared to be just their type, because they preferred inherited wealth in Darrowby. In contrast to what I have always found in Scotland, the self-made man was regarded with deep suspicion, and there was nothing so damning among the townsfolk as the darkly muttered comment, "He had nowt when he first come here." Of course, when the scales had fallen from their eyes, they fought back, but ineffectually. The local garage impounded the Major's ancient Rolls-Royce, and hung onto it fiercely for a while, but he managed to charm it back. His one failure was that his telephone was always being cut off. It seemed that the Postmaster General was one of the very few who were immune to his blandishments. But time runs out even for the most dedicated expert. I was driving one day through Hollerton, a neighbouring market town about 10 miles away, and I noticed the Bullivant girls moving purposefully among the shops armed with large baskets. The Major, it seemed, was having to cast his net a little wider, and I wondered at the time if perhaps he was ready to move on. He did, in fact, disappear from the district a few weeks later, leaving a lot of people licking their wounds. I don't know if he ever paid anybody before he left, but Siegfried didn't get anything. Even after his departure, Siegfried wasn't at all bitter, preferring to regard the Major as a unique phenomenon, a master of his chosen craft. "After all, James," he said to me once, "putting ethical considerations to one side, you must admit that anybody who can run up a bill of £50 for shaves and haircuts at the Darrowby barber's shop must command a certain amount of respect." Siegfried's attitude to his debtors was remarkably ambivalent. At times he would fly into a fury at the mention of their names, at others he would regard them with a kind of wry benevolence. He often said that if ever he threw a cocktail party for the clients, he'd have to invite the non-payers first, because they were all such charming fellows. Nevertheless, he waged an inexorable war against them, by means of a series of letters graduated according to severity, which he called his P&S system: polite, nasty, solicitors, and in which he had great faith. It was a sad fact, however, that the system seldom worked with the real hard cases, who were accustomed to receiving threatening letters with their morning mail. These people yawned over the polite and nasty ones, and were unimpressed by the solicitors, because they knew from experience that Siegfried always shrank from following through to the limit of the law. When the P&S system failed, Siegfried was inclined to come up with some unorthodox ideas to collect his hard-earned fees. Like the scheme he devised for Dennis Pratt. Dennis was a tubby, bouncy little man, and his high opinion of himself showed in the way he always carried his entire 5'3" proudly erect. He always seemed to be straining upwards, his chest thrust forward, his fat little bottom stuck out behind him at an extraordinary angle. Dennis owed the practice a substantial amount, and about 18 months ago he had been subjected to the full rigour of the P&S system. This had induced him to part with £5 on account, but since then nothing more had been forthcoming. Siegfried was in a quandary, because he didn't like getting tough with such a cheerful, hospitable man. Dennis was always either laughing or about to laugh. I remember when we had to anaesthetise a cow on his farm to remove a growth from between its cleats. Siegfried and I went to the case together, and on the way we were talking about something which had amused us. As we got out of the car, we were both laughing helplessly, and just then the farmhouse door opened and Dennis emerged. We were at the far end of the yard and must have been all of 30 yards away. He couldn't possibly have heard anything of our conversation, but when he saw us laughing, he threw back his head immediately and joined in at the top of his voice. He shook so much on his way across the yard that I thought he'd fall over, and when he arrived, he was wiping the tears from his eyes. After a job, he always asked us to sample Mrs. Pratt's baking. In fact, on cold days, he used to keep a thermos of hot coffee ready for our arrival, and had an endearing habit of sloshing rum freely into each cup before pouring in the coffee. "Well, you can't put a man like that in court," Siegfried said, "but we've got to find some way of parting him from his brass." He looked ruminatively at the ceiling for a few moments, then thumped a fist into his palm. "I think I've got it, James. You know, it's quite possible it just never occurs to Dennis to pay a bill. So I'm going to pitch him into an environment where it will be really brought home to him. The accounts have just gone out, and I'll arrange to meet him here at 2 o'clock next market day. I'll say I want to discuss his mastitis problem. He'll be right in the middle of all the other farmers paying their bills, and I'll deliberately leave him with them for about half an hour or so. I'm sure it'll give him the notion." I couldn't help feeling dubious. I had known Siegfried long enough to realise that some of his ideas were brilliant, and others balmy. And he had so many ideas, and they came in such a constant torrent, that I often had difficulty in deciding which was which. Clearly in this case he was working on the same lines as a doctor, who turns on a water tap full force to induce a pent-up patient to urinate into a bottle. The scheme may have merit. It was possible that the flutter of checkbooks, the chink of coins, the rustle of notes might tap the long-buried well of debt in Dennis and bring it gushing from him in a mighty flood. But I doubted it. My doubts must have shown on my face because Siegfried laughed and thumped me on the shoulder. "Don't look so worried. We can only try. And it'll work. Just you wait." After lunch on market day, I was looking out of the window when I saw Dennis heading our way. The street was busy with the market bustle, but he was easy to pick out. Chin in air, beaming around him happily, every springing step taking him high on tiptoe, he was a distinctive figure. I let him in at the front door, and he strutted past me along the passage, the back of his natty sports jacket lying in a neat fold over his protruding buttocks. Siegfried seated him strategically by Miss Harbottle's elbow, giving him an unimpeded view of the desk. Then he excused himself, saying he had a dog to attend to in the operating room. I stayed behind to answer the client's queries and to watch developments. I hadn't long to wait. The farmers began to come in, a steady stream of them, clutching their checkbooks. Some of them stood patiently by the desk, others sat in the chairs along the walls waiting their turn. It was a typical bill-paying day with the usual quota of moans. The most common expression was that Mr. Farnon had been "our heavy-whip pen," and many of them wanted a bit knocking off. Miss Harbottle used her discretion in these matters, and if the animal had died or the bill had seemed unduly large, she would make some reduction. There was one man who didn't get away with it. He had truculently demanded a bit of luck on an account, and Miss Harbottle fixed him with a cold eye. "Mr. Brewis," she said, "this account has been owing for over a year. You should really be paying us interest. I can only allow discount when a bill is paid promptly. It's too bad of you to let it run for this length of time." Dennis, sitting bolt upright, his hands resting on his knees, obviously agreed with every word. He pursed his lips in disapproval as he looked at the farmer, and turned towards me with a positively scandalized expression. Among the complaints was an occasional bouquet. A stooping old man who had received one of the polite letters was full of apologies. "I'm sorry I've missed paying for a few months. The vets allus come straight away when I send for them, so I reckon it's not fair for me to keep them waiting for their money." I could see that Dennis concurred entirely with this sentiment. He nodded vigorously and smiled benevolently at the old man. Another farmer, a hard-looking character, was walking out without his receipt when Miss Harbottle called him back. "You'd better take this with you, or we might ask you to pay again," she said, with a heavy attempt at roguishness. The man paused with his hand on the doorknob. "I'll tell you something, missus. You're bloody lucky to get it once. You'd never get it twice." Dennis was right in the thick of it. Watching closely as the farmers slapped their checkbooks on the desk for Miss Harbottle to write, they never wrote their own checks, then signed them slowly and painstakingly. He looked with open fascination at the neat bundles of notes being tucked away in the desk drawer, and I kept making little provocative remarks like, "Well, it's nice to see the money coming in. We can't carry on without it, can we?" The queue began to thin out, and sometimes we were left alone in the room. On these occasions we conversed about many things: the weather, Dennis's stock, the political situation. Finally, Siegfried came in, and I left to do a round. When I got back, Siegfried was at his evening meal. I was eager to hear how his scheme had worked out, but he was strangely reticent. At length I could wait no longer. "Well, how did it go?" I asked. Siegfried speared a piece of steak with his fork and applied some mustard. "How did what go?" "Well, Dennis." "How did you make out with him?" "Oh, fine. We went into his mastitis problem very thoroughly. I'm going out there on Tuesday morning to infuse every infected quarter in the herd with acreflavin solution. Yeah, it's a new treatment. They say it's very good. But you know what I mean." "Did he show any sign of paying his bill?" Siegfried chewed impassively for a few moments and swallowed. "No, never a sign." He put down his knife and fork, and a haggard look spread over his face. "It didn't work, did it?" "Oh, well, never mind. As you said, we could only try. I hesitated. There's something else, Siegfried. I'm afraid you're going to be annoyed with me. I know you've told me never to dish out stuff to people who don't pay, but he talked me into letting him have a couple of bottles of fever drink. I don't know what came over me. He did he? Siegfried stared into space for a second, then gave a wintry smile. Well, you can forget about that. He got 6 tins of stomach powder out of me. Chapter 56. There was one client who would not have been invited to the debtors' cocktail party. He was Mr. Horace Dumbleby, the butcher of Aldgrove. As an inveterate non-payer, he fulfilled the main qualification for the function, but he was singularly lacking in charm. His butcher shop in the main street of picturesque Aldgrove village was busy and prosperous, but most of his trade was done in the neighbouring smaller villages and among the scattered farmhouses of the district. Usually the butcher's wife and married daughter looked after the shop while Mr. Dumbleby himself did the rounds. I often saw his blue van standing with the back doors open and a farmer's wife waiting while he cut the meat, his big, shapeless body hunched over the slab. Sometimes he would look up, and I would catch a momentary glimpse of a huge bloodhound face and melancholy eyes. Mr. Dumbleby was a farmer himself in a small way. He sold milk from 6 cows which he kept in a tidy little byre behind his shop, and he fattened a few bullocks and pork pigs which later appeared as sausages, pies, roasting cuts and chops in his front window. In fact, Mr. Dumbleby seemed to be very nicely fixed, and it was said he owned property all over the place. But Siegfried had only infrequent glimpses of his money. All the slow payers had one thing in common. They would not tolerate slowness from the vets. When they were in trouble, they demanded immediate action. "Will you come at once? How long will you be? You won't keep me waiting, will you? I want you to come out here straight away." It used to alarm me to see the veins swelling on Siegfried's forehead, the knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. After one such session with Mr. Dumbleby at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, he had flown into a rage and unleashed the full fury of the PNS system on him. It had no loosening effect on the butcher's purse strings, but it did wound his feelings deeply. He obviously considered himself a wronged man. From that time on, whenever I saw him with his van out in the country, he would turn slowly and direct a blank stare at me till I was out of sight. And strangely, I seemed to see him more and more often. The thing became unnerving. And there was something worse. Tristan and I used to frequent the little Aldgrove pub, where the bar was cosy and the beer measured up to Tristan's stringent standards. I had never taken much notice of Mr. Dumbleby before, although he always occupied the same corner, but now, every time I looked up, the great sad eyes were trained on me in disapproval. I tried to forget about him and listen to Tristan relating his stories from the backs of envelopes, but all the time I could feel that gaze upon me. My laughter would trail away and I would have to look round. Then the excellent bitter would be as vinegar in my mouth. In an attempt to escape, I took to visiting the snug instead of the bar, and Tristan, showing true nobility of soul, came with me into an environment which was alien to him, where there was a carpet on the floor, people sitting around at little shiny tables drinking gin and hardly a pint in sight. But even this sacrifice was in vain, because Mr. Dumbleby changed his position in the bar so that he could look into the snug through the communicating hatch. The odd hours I was able to spend there took on a macabre quality. I was like a man trying desperately to forget. But quaff the beer as I might, laugh, talk, even sing, half of me was waiting in a state of acute apprehension for the moment when I knew I would have to look round. And when I did, the great sombre face looked even more forbidding, framed by the wooden surround of the hatch. The hanging jowls, the terraced chins, the huge brooding eyes, all were dreadfully magnified by their isolation in that little hole in the wall. It was no good. I had to stop going to the place. This was very sad, because Tristan used to wax lyrical about a certain unique, delicate nuttiness which he could discern in the draught bitter. But it had lost all its joy for me. I just couldn't take any more of Mr. Dumbleby. In fact, I did my best to forget all about the gentleman, but he was brought back forcibly into my mind when I heard his voice on the phone at 3 a.m. one morning. It was nearly always the same thing when the bedside phone exploded in your ear in the small hours. A carving. Mr. Dumbleby's call was no exception, but he was more peremptory than might have been expected. There was no question about apologizing about ringing at such an hour as most farmers would do. I said I would come immediately, but that wasn't good enough. He wanted to know exactly in minutes how long I would be. In a sleepy attempt at sarcasm, I started to recite a program of so many minutes to get up and dressed, so many to go downstairs and get the car out, etc. But I fear it was lost on him. When I drove into the sleeping village, a light was showing in the window of the butcher's shop. Mr. Dumbleby almost trotted out into the street and paced up and down, muttering, as I fished out my ropes and instruments from the boot. Very impatient, I thought, for a man who hadn't paid his vet bill for over a year. We had to go through the shop to get to the bar in the rear. My patient was a big, fat, white cow, which didn't seem particularly perturbed by her situation. Now and then she strained, pushing a pair of feet a few inches from her vulva. I took a keen look at those feet. It is the vet's first indication of how tough the job's going to be. 2 huge hooves sticking out of a tiny heifer have always been able to wipe the smile off my face. These feet were big enough, but not out of the way, and in truth, the mother looked sufficiently roomy. I wondered what was stopping the natural sequence. "I've had me hand in," said Mr. Dumbleby. "There's a head there, but I can't shift out. I've been pulling them legs for half an hour." As I stripped to the waist, it was still considered vaguely sissy to wear a carving overall. I reflected that things could be a lot worse. So many of the buildings where I'd had to take my shirt off were primitive and drafty, but this was a modern cowhouse, and the 6 cows provided a very adequate central heating. And there was electricity in place of the usual smoke-blackened oil lamp. When I had soaped and disinfected my arms, I made my first exploration, and it wasn't difficult to find the cause of the trouble. There was a head and 2 legs, all right, but they belonged to different calves. "We've got twins here," I said. "These are hind legs you've been pulling. A posterior presentation." "Arse first, you mean?" "If you like." "And the calf that's coming the right way has both his legs back along his sides. Now I'll have to push him back out of the way and get the other one first." This was going to be a pretty tight squeeze. Normally I like a twin calving because the calves are usually so small, but these seem to be quite big. I put my hand against the little muzzle in the passage, poked a finger into the mouth, and was rewarded by a jerk and flip of the tongue. He was alive anyway. I began to push him steadily back into the uterus, wondering at the same time what the little creature was making of it. He had almost entered the world. His nostrils had been a couple of inches from the outside air, and now he was being returned to the starting post. The cow didn't think much of the idea either, because she started a series of straining heaves with the object of frustrating me. She did a pretty fair job, too, since a cow is a lot stronger than a man. But I kept my arm rigid against the calf, and though each heave forced me back, I maintained a steady pressure till I had pushed him to the brim of the pelvis. I turned to Mr. Dumbleby and gasped, "I've got his head out of the way. Get hold of those feet and pull the other calf out." The butcher stepped forward ponderously, and each of his big, meaty hands engulfed a foot. Then he closed his eyes, and with many facial contortions and noises of painful effort, he began to go through the motions of tugging. The calf didn't move an inch, and my spirits drooped. Mr. Dumbleby was a grunter. This expression had its origin in an occasion when Siegfried and a farmer had a foot apiece at a carving, and the farmer was making pitiful sounds without exerting himself in the slightest. Siegfried had turned to him and said, "Look, let's come to an arrangement. You do the pulling, and I'll do the grunting." It was clear I was going to get no help from the big butcher, and decided to have one go by myself. I might be lucky. I let go the muzzle and made a quick grab for those hind feet, but the cow was too quick for me. I had just got a slippery grasp when she made a single, expulsive effort and pushed calf number 2 into the passage again. I was back where I started. Once more I put my hand against the wet little muzzle and began the painful process of repulsion. And as I fought against the big cow's straining, I was reminded that it was 4 a.m., when none of us feels very strong. By the time I had worked the head back to the pelvic inlet, I was feeling the beginning of that deadly creeping weakness, and it seemed as though somebody had removed most of the bones from my arm. This time I took a few seconds to get my breath back before I made my dive for the feet, but it was no good. The cow beat me easily with a beautifully timed contraction. Again, that intruding head was jammed tight in the passage. I had had enough, and it occurred to me that the little creature inside must also be getting a little tired of this back-and-forth business. I shivered my way through the cold, empty shop out into the silent street and collected the local anaesthetic from the car. 8 cc's into the epidural space, and the cow, its uterus completely numbed, lost all interest in the proceedings. In fact, she pulled a little hay from her rack and began to chew absently. From then on, it was like working inside a mailbag. Whatever I pushed stayed put instead of surging back at me. The only snag was that once I had got everything straight, there were no uterine contractions to help me. It was a case of pulling. Leaning back on a hind leg, and with Mr. Dumbleby panting in agony on the other, the posterior presentation was soon delivered. He had inhaled a fair amount of placental fluid, but I held him upside down till he had coughed it up. When I laid him on the byre floor, he shook his head vigorously and tried to sit up. Then I had to go in after my old friend, the second calf. He was lying well inside now, apparently sulking. When I finally brought him, snuffling and kicking into the light, I couldn't have blamed him if he had said, "Make up your mind, will you?" Toweling my chest, I looked with the sharp stab of pleasure I always felt at the 2 wet little animals, wriggling on the floor, as Mr. Dumbleby rubbed them down with a handful of straw. "Big uns for twins," the butcher muttered. Even this modest expression of approval surprised me, and it seemed I might as well push things along a bit. "Yes, they're 2 grand calves. Twins are often dead when they're mixed up like that. Good job we got 'em out alive." I paused a moment. "You know, those 2 must be worth a fair bit." Mr. Dumbleby didn't answer, and I couldn't tell whether the shaft had gone home. I got dressed, gathered up my gear, and followed him out of the byre, and into the silent shop past the rows of beef cuts hanging from hooks, the trays of offal, the mounds of freshly made sausages. Near the outside door, the butcher halted and stood irresolute for a moment. He seemed to be thinking hard. Then he turned to me. "Would you like a few sausages?" I almost reeled in my astonishment. "Yes. Thank you very much, I would." It was scarcely credible, but I must have touched the man's heart. He went over, cut about a pound of links, wrapped them quickly in greaseproof paper, and handed the parcel to me. I looked down at the sausages, feeling the cold weight on my hand. I still couldn't believe it. Then an unworthy thought welled in my mind. It wasn't fair, I know. The poor fellow couldn't have known the luxury of many generous impulses, but some inner demon drove me to put him to the test. I put a hand in my trouser pocket, jingled my loose chains, and looked him in the eye. "Well, how much will that be?" I asked. Mr. Dumbleby's big frame froze suddenly into immobility, and he stood for a few seconds perfectly motionless. His face, as he stared at me, was almost without expression. But a single twitch of the cheek, and a slowly rising anguish in the eyes betrayed the internal battle which was raging. When he did speak, it was in a husky whisper, as though the words had been forced from him by a power beyond his control. "That," he said, "will be 2 and 6pence. Chapter 57. It was a new experience for me to be standing outside the hospital waiting for the nurses to come off duty. But it was old stuff to Tristan, who was to be found there several nights a week. His experience showed in various ways, but mainly in the shrewd position he took up in a dark corner of the doorway of the gas company office just beyond the splash of light thrown by the street lamp. From there he could look straight across the road into the square entrance of the hospital, and the long white corridor leading to the nurses' quarters. And there was the other advantage that if Siegfried should happen to pass that way, Tristan would be invisible and safe. At 7:30, he nudged me. 2 girls had come out of the hospital and down the steps and were standing expectantly in the street. Tristan looked warily in both directions before taking my arm. "Come on, Jim." "Here they are. That's Connie on the left. The coppery blonde. Lovely little thing." We went over and Tristan introduced me with characteristic charm. I had to admit that if the evening had indeed been arranged for therapeutic purposes, I was beginning to feel better already. There was something healing in the way the 2 pretty girls looked up at me with parted lips and shining eyes, as though I was the answer to every prayer they'd ever offered. They were remarkably alike except for the hair. Brenda was very dark, but Connie was fair with a deep, fiery glow where the light from the doorway touched her head. Both of them projected a powerful image of bursting health. Fresh cheeks, white teeth, lively eyes, and something else which I found particularly easy to take, a simple desire to please. Tristan opened the back door of the car with a flourish. "Be careful with him in there, Connie. He looks quiet, but he's a devil with women. Known far and wide as a great lover." The girls giggled and studied me with even greater interest. Tristan leapt into the driver's seat, and we set off at breakneck speed. As the dark countryside hastened past the windows, I leaned back in the corner and listened to Tristan, who was in full cry. Maybe in a kindly attempt to cheer me, or maybe because he just felt that way, but his flow of chatter was unceasing. The girls made an ideal audience because they laughed in delight at everything he said. I could feel Connie shaking against me. She was sitting very close, with a long stretch of empty seat on the other side of her. The little car swayed round a sharp corner and threw her against me, and she stayed there quite naturally with her head on my shoulder. I felt her hair against my cheek. She didn't use much perfume, but smelt cleanly of soap and antiseptic. My mind went back to Helen. I didn't think much about her these days. It was just a question of practice. To scotch every thought of her as soon as it came up. I was getting pretty good at it now. Anyway, it was all over. All over before it had begun. I put my arm round Connie and she lifted her face to me. "Ah, well," I thought, as I kissed her. Tristan's voice rose in song from the front seat. Brenda giggled. The old car sped over the rough road with 1,000 rattles. We came at last to Poulton, a village on the road to nowhere. Its single street straggled untidily up the hillside to the dead end, where there was a circular green, with an ancient stone cross and a steep mound on which was perched the Institute Hall. This was where the dance was to be held, but Tristan had other plans first. "There's a lovely little pub here. We'll just have a toothful to get us in the mood." We got out of the car, and Tristan ushered us into a low stone building. There was nothing of the old world about the place, just a large, square, whitewashed room, with a black cooking range enclosing a bright fire and a long, high-backed wooden settle facing it. Over the fireplace stretched a single immense beam, gnarled and pitted with the years and blackened with smoke. We hurried over to the settle, feeling the comfort of it as a screen against the cold outside. We had the place to ourselves. The landlord came in. He was dressed informally. No jacket, striped, collarless shirt, trousers and braces which were reinforced by a broad leather belt around his middle. His cheerful round face lit up at the sight of Tristan. "Now then, Mr. Farnon. Are you very well?" "Never better, Mr. Peacock, and how are you?" "Nicely, sir, very nicely, can't complain, and I recognise the other gentleman. Been in my place before, haven't you?" I remembered then. A day's testing in the Poulton district, and I'd come in here for a meal, freezing and half-starved after hours of wrestling with young beasts on the high moor. The landlord had received me unemotionally, and had set to immediately with his frying pan on the old black range, while I sat looking at his shirt back and the braces and the shining leather belt. The meal had taken up the whole of the round oak table by the fire. A thick steak of home-cured ham overlapping the plate, with 2 fresh eggs nestling on its bosom. A newly baked loaf with a knife sticking in it, a dish of farm butter, some jam, a vast pot of tea, and a whole Wensleydale cheese, circular, snow-white, about 18 inches high. I could remember eating unbelievingly for a long time, and finishing with slice after slice of the moist, delicately flavoured cheese. The entire meal had cost me £0.50. "Yes, Mr. Peacock, I have been here before, and if I'm ever starving on a desert island, I'll think of that wonderful meal you gave me." The landlord shrugged. "Well, it was not much, sir. Just usual stuff." But he looked pleased. "Well, that's fine then," Tristan said impatiently. "But we haven't come to eat, we've come for a drink, and Mr. Peacock keeps some of the finest draft magnet in Yorkshire. I'd welcome your opinion on it, Jim. Perhaps you would be kind enough to bring us 2 pints and 2 halves, Mr. Peacock." I noticed there was no question of asking the girls what they would like to have, but they seemed quite happy with the arrangement. The landlord reappeared from the cellar, puffing slightly. He was carrying a tall, white enamel jug from which he poured a thin brown stream, varying the height expertly till he had produced a white, frothy head on each glass. Tristan raised his pint and looked at it with quiet reverence. He sniffed it carefully, and then took a sip which he retained in his mouth for a few seconds while his jaw moved rapidly up and down. After swallowing, he smacked his lips a few times with the utmost solemnity, then closed his eyes and took a deep gulp. He kept his eyes closed for a long time, and when he opened them, they were rapturous, as though he had seen a beautiful vision. It's an experience coming here," he whispered. "Keeping beer in the wood is a skillful business, but you, Mr. Peacock, are an artist." The landlord inclined his head modestly, and Tristan, raising his glass in salute, drained it with an easy upward motion of the elbow. Little oohs of admiration came from the girls, but I saw that they in their turn had little difficulty in emptying their glasses. With an effort I got my own pint down, and the enamel jug was immediately in action again. I was always at a disadvantage, in the company of a virtuoso like Tristan. But as the time passed and the landlord kept revisiting the cellar with his jug, it seemed to become easier. In fact, a long time later, as I drew confidently on my 8th pint, I wondered why I had ever had difficulty with large amounts of fluid. It was easy, and it soothed and comforted. Tristan was right. I had been needing this. It puzzled me that I hadn't realized until now that Connie was one of the most beautiful creatures I'd ever seen. Back there in the street outside the hospital she had seemed attractive, but obviously the light had been bad, and I had failed to notice the perfection of her skin, the mysterious greenish depth of her eyes, and the wonderful hair catching lights of gold and deep red bronze from the flickering fire, and the laughing mouth, shining even teeth, and little pink tongue. She hardly ever stopped laughing, except to drink her beer. Everything I said was witty, brilliantly funny, in fact. And she looked at me all the time, peeping over the top of her glass in open admiration. It was profoundly reassuring. As the beer flowed, time slowed down, and finally lurched to a halt, and there was neither past nor future, only Connie's face and the warm, untroubled present. I was surprised when Tristan pulled at my arm. I had forgotten he was there, and when I focused on him, it was the same as with Connie. There was just the face, swimming disembodied in an empty room. Only this face was very red and puffy and glassy-eyed. "Would you care for the mad conductor?" the face said. I was deeply touched. Here was another sign of my friend's concern for me. Of all Tristan's repertoire, his imitation of a mad conductor was the most exacting. It involved tremendous expenditure of energy, and since Tristan was unused to any form of physical activity, it really took it out of him. Yet here he was, ready and willing to sacrifice himself. A wave of treacly sentiment flooded through me, and I wondered for a second if it might not be the proper thing to burst into tears, but instead I contented myself with wringing Tristan's hand. "There's nothing I would like more, my dear old chap," I said thickly. "I greatly appreciate the kind thought, and may I take this opportunity of telling you that I consider that in all Yorkshire there is no finer gentleman breathing than T. Farnon." The big red face grew very solemn. "You honour me with those words, old friend?" Not a bit of it, I slurred. My stumbling sentences cannot hope to express my extremely high opinion of you. You are too kind, hiccuped Tristan. Nothing of the sort. It's a privilege. It's a rare privilege to know you. Thank you. Thank you. Tristan nodded gravely at me from a distance of about 6 inches. We were staring into each other's eyes with intense absorption, and the conversation might have gone on for a long time if Brenda hadn't broken in. Hey, when you two have finished rubbing noses, I'd rather like another drink. Tristan gave her a cold look. You'll just have to wait a few minutes. There's something I have to do. He rose, shook himself, and walked with dignity to the centre of the floor. When he turned to face his audience, he looked exalted. I felt this would be an outstanding performance. Tristan raised his arms and gazed imperiously over his imaginary orchestra, taking in the packed rows of strings, the woodwind, brass, and timpani in one sweeping glance. Then, with a violent downswing, he led them into the overture. Rossini this time, I thought, or maybe Wagner, as I watched him throwing his head about, bringing in the violins with a waving clenched fist, or exhorting the trumpets with a glare and a trembling outstretched hand. It was somewhere near the middle of the piece that the rot always set in, and I watched enthralled as the face began to twitch and the lips to snarl. The arm waving became more and more convulsive, then the whole body jerked with uncontrollable spasms. It was clear that the end was near. Tristan's eyes were rolling, his hair hung over his face, and he had lost control of the music, which crashed and billowed about him. Suddenly he grew rigid, his arms fell to his sides, and he crashed to the floor. I was joining in the applause and laughter when I noticed that Tristan was very still. I bent over him and found that he had struck his head against the heavy oak leg of the settle, and was almost unconscious. The nurses were quickly into action. Brenda expertly propped up his head while Connie ran for a basin of hot water and a cloth. When he opened his eyes, they were bathing a tender lump above his ear. Mr. Peacock hovered anxiously in the background. Is that all right? Can I do anything? Tristan sat up and sipped weakly at his beer. He was very pale. I'll be all right in a minute, and there is something you can do. You can bring us one for the road, and then we must be getting on to this dance. The landlord hurried away and returned with the enamel jug brimming. The final pint revived Tristan miraculously, and he was soon on his feet. Then we shook hands affectionately with Mr. Peacock and took our leave. After the brightness of the inn, the darkness pressed on us like a blanket, and we groped our way up the steep street till we could see the Institute standing on its grassy mound. Faint rays of light escaped through the chinks in the curtained windows, and we could hear music and a rhythmic thudding. A cheerful young farmer took our money at the door, and when we went into the hall we were swallowed up in a tight mass of dancers. The place was packed solidly with young men in stiff-looking dark suits and girls in bright dresses, all sweating happily as they swayed and wheeled to the music. On the low platform at one end, 4 musicians were playing their hearts out: piano, accordion, violin, and drums. At the other end, several comfortable middle-aged women stood behind a long table on trestles, presiding over the thick sandwiches of ham and brawn, homemade pies, jugs of milk and trifles generously laid with cream. All around the walls more lads were standing, eyeing the unattached girls. I recognized the young client. "What do you call this dance?" I yelled above the din. "The Eva 3-step," came back the reply. This was new to me, but I launched out confidently with Connie. There was a lot of twirling and stamping, and when the men brought their heavy boots down on the boards, the hall shook and the noise was deafening. I loved it. I was right on the peak, and I whirled Connie effortlessly round among the throng. I was dimly aware of bumping people with my shoulders, but try as I might, I couldn't feel my feet touching the floor. The floating sensation was delicious. I decided that I had never been so happy in my life. After half a dozen dances, I felt ravenous and floated with Connie towards the food table. We each ate an enormous wedge of ham and egg pie, which was so exquisite that we had the same again. Then we had some trifle and plunged again into the crush. It was about halfway through a St. Bernard's waltz that I began to feel my feet on the boards again. Quite heavy and dragging somewhat. Connie felt heavy too. She seemed to be slumped in my arms. She looked up. Her face was very white. "Just feeling a bit queer. Excuse me." She broke away and began to tack erratically towards the ladies' room. A few minutes later, she came out and her face was no longer white. It was green. She staggered over to me. "Could do with some fresh air. Take me outside." I took her out into the darkness, and it was as if I had stepped aboard a ship. The ground pitched and heaved under my feet, and I had to straddle my legs to stay upright. Holding Connie's arm, I retreated hastily to the wall of the institute and leant my back against it. This didn't help a great deal because the wall too was heaving about. Waves of nausea swept over me. I thought of the ham and egg pie and groaned loudly. Open-mouthed, gulping in the sharp air, I looked up at the clean, austere sweep of the night sky and at the ragged clouds driving across the cold face of the moon. "Oh, God!" I moaned at the unheeding stars. "Why did I drink all that bloody beer?" But I had to look after Connie. I put my arm round her. "Come on, we better start walking." We began to reel blindly round the building, pausing after every 2 or 3 circuits while I got my breath back and shook my head violently to try to clear my brain. But our course was erratic, and I forgot that the institute was perched on a little steep-sided hill. There was an instant when we were treading on nothing. Then we were sprawling down a muddy bank. We finished in a tangled heap on the hard road at the bottom. I lay there peacefully till I heard a pitiful whimpering nearby. Connie. Probably a compound fracture at least. But when I helped her up, I found she was unhurt, and so, surprisingly, was I. After our large intake of alcohol, we must have been as relaxed as rag dolls as we fell. We went back into the institute and stood just inside the door. Connie was unrecognizable. Her beautiful hair hung across her face in straggling wisps. Her eyes were vacant and tears coursed slowly through the muddy smears on her cheeks. My suit was splattered with clay and I could feel more of it drying on one side of my face. We stood close, leaning miserably on each other in the doorway. The dancers were a shapeless blur. My stomach heaved and tossed. Then I heard somebody say, "Good evening." It was a woman's voice and very close. There were 2 figures looking at us with interest. They seemed to have just come through the door. I concentrated fiercely on them, and they swam into focus for a few seconds. It was Helen and a man. His pink, scrub-looking face, the shining fair hair plastered sideways across the top of his head was in keeping with the spotless British warm overcoat. He was staring at me distastefully. They went out of focus again, and there was only Helen's voice. "We thought we'd just look in for a few moments to see how the dance was going. Are you enjoying it?" Then, unexpectedly, I could see her clearly. She was smiling her kind smile, but her eyes were strained as she looked from me to Connie and back again. I couldn't speak, but stood gazing at her dully, seeing only her calm beauty in the crush and noise. It seemed for a moment that it would be the most natural thing in the world to throw my arms around her, but I discarded the idea and instead just nodded stupidly. "Well then, we must be off," she said, and smiled again. "Good night." The fair-haired man gave me a cold nod, and they went out.